Hey guys, when most people picture the Middle Ages, they imagine mud, castles, and endless hardship. But tucked inside that thousand-year stretch are habits and trends that feel oddly modern, surprisingly practical, and sometimes genuinely absurd. Some of them were clever solutions to real problems. Others were pure status theater. And a few are the kind of thing you'd swear must be a myth, until you find them turning up in records, art, and city rules. If you enjoy slow, careful history, stories with sources, context, and the kind of detail you can listen to while you unwind, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they don't miss the next long-form deep dive. Now, to the medieval trends that, in one form or another, might actually deserve a comeback, and to the ones that are fascinating precisely because they probably shouldn't. To talk about medieval trends at all, we need to start with a quiet correction. Medieval doesn't mean one place, one culture, or one lifestyle. The period is usually framed in Europe from roughly the 5th to the 15th century, but within that range are worlds apart. Early medieval villages, booming high medieval towns, plague-era labor shortages, courtly cultures, monastic networks, and international trade routes that tied England to the Baltic, Italy to the Levant, and Iberia to North Africa. Trends spread along those routes the way they spread today, through money, aspiration, imitation, and the basic human desire to look like you belong to the winning side of history. One of the most immediately recognizable medieval trends is also one of the most misunderstood: the idea that people rarely bathed. In reality, bathing existed across the medieval centuries, and in many towns public bathhouses were common, sometimes operating as social centers as much as hygienic ones. What changed over time wasn't human interest in cleanliness so much as local infrastructure, public health fears, and the moral anxieties that gathered around mixed-gender spaces. The comeback here isn't bring back medieval bathing, as if we ever left bathing behind. It's the broader principle, the bathhouse as a community institution. Medieval towns, when they could support it, treated bathing as something you did in public life, not only in private. There's something quietly civilizing about that, about building cities that assume people deserve warmth, water, and a moment to reset. Modern urban planning sometimes circles back to the same idea with spas, saunas, and community pools, but the medieval example reminds us that public hygiene can be social, normal, and surprisingly ordinary. Another trend that feels unexpectedly relevant is the medieval approach to time. In much of medieval Europe, especially before mechanical clocks became widespread, time was not always a hard grid of minutes. It was often a living thing shaped by daylight, season, and communal routines. Bells for prayers, markets, curfews, and work rhythms. This is where we get one of those medieval practices that sounds absurd until you sit with it: night regulations and curfews enforced by city watchmen. In many towns, the night was treated as a separate moral and logistical universe. Fires were a constant threat. Crime was easier in the dark. Streets weren't lit like ours. So cities developed rituals of closure: bells, gates, patrols, rules about carrying weapons or moving after hours. We don't want to romanticize strict curfews, but the underlying concept is worth revisiting. A city that takes night seriously, not as a time for fear or neglect, but as a different mode of life that requires design, lighting, safety, quiet, and predictable services. Medieval towns, for all their limitations, didn't imagine the night would manage itself. Then there's the medieval obsession with clothing laws, sumptuary laws, which is one of the clearest windows into how status worked. In many regions, authorities tried to regulate who could wear what certain fabrics, furs, colors, sleeves, trims, or decorations. On paper, it looks like a bizarre, fussy obsession with hemlines and hats. In practice, it was about economics and social order. Clothing signaled rank at a glance. It told you who could command and who must defer. When new wealth rose, merchants, financiers, skilled trades, clothing became a battlefield. The established elite often responded by trying to freeze the social hierarchy in law. The absurdity is obvious. The state telling you what you're allowed to look like. But here's the twist. Underneath the snobbery is a surprisingly modern concern. Runaway consumption and debt fueled by appearance. Some medieval regulations aimed to limit extravagance because families were spending beyond their means to keep up. If there's a comeback worth considering, it's not medieval dress policing. It's the public recognition that status consumption can be socially corrosive. The medieval world could be cruelly hierarchical, but it wasn't naive about what constant performance does to people. A more genuinely charming medieval trend is the culture of repair, reuse, and visible mending. Medieval textiles were labor-intensive. Cloth was valuable. Clothing was altered, patched, and handed down. Shoes were repaired. Metalwork was reforged. Everyday objects were kept in use far longer than we would tolerate today. This wasn't virtue signaling. It was survival economics. Yet it created a material culture where repair was normal and skilled trades were central: cobblers, tailors, smiths, tanners, and weavers. A comeback here is easy to imagine. Designing goods that assume they'll be repaired, and supporting the people who know how to repair them. Medieval life made craft visible. You lived among the tools and the trades that kept society running. Modern life often hides that labor. Bringing it back would make us less wasteful and more resilient. Of course, not every medieval trend deserves a warm endorsement. Consider footwear, and particularly the infamous pointed shoe, often called the poulain. In some late medieval contexts, fashionable shoes extended into long points that could be impractical to the point of comedy. Sometimes the points were so long they had to be tied up to the leg. This wasn't a mistake. It was the point. The longer and more useless the shoe, the louder it signaled that you didn't need to walk for work. It was leisure turned into geometry. What makes it historically useful is the clarity of the message. Fashion as a language of power. The medieval elite didn't just own wealth. They wore it in shapes that said, "I live by different rules." If we brought back anything from this trend, it would be the historian's ability to read fashion as a social document, rather than pretending clothing is purely personal choice. Medieval shoes make the argument for you. Another strange and revealing trend is medieval table culture, especially the way people managed food and cleanliness without modern conveniences. In many settings, trenchers, thick slices of bread used as plates, served a practical purpose. They absorbed juices, could be eaten or given away afterward. It's easy to laugh at the idea of edible dishware, but it's also an elegant solution in a world without cheap ceramics for everyone. Trenchers show how medieval society blended practicality with ritual. Meals were social events with rules of seating, carving, serving, and sharing. A comeback here might not be bread plates in your kitchen, but the broader principle of low-waste dining and communal food culture. Medieval meals, at least in households that could afford it, were structured around shared dishes, seasonal ingredients, and an expectation that leftovers and scraps had a destination, whether in the household, as alms, or as feed. Now, let's talk about something that sounds modern but has deep medieval roots. Public information systems. Medieval towns weren't silent. They were full of announcements, criers, bells, posted ordinances, and the physical theater of public notice. In a largely oral culture, information had to be performed. Rules about markets, measures, prices, and behavior were not just written. They were proclaimed. You might think of this as primitive compared to our digital world. But in another sense, it's refreshingly transparent. City life assumed that governance had to be heard where people actually were. If you want a trend worth revisiting, it's the idea that public communication should be accessible by default, not hidden in bureaucratic language or scattered across platforms. The medieval town crier is a reminder. Information is only real if it reaches the street. Not all medieval trends are about cities. Some of the most important ones are about institutions that quietly shaped Europe for centuries. Monasteries, cathedrals, and universities. One of the medieval world's most effective growth strategies, to borrow a modern phrase, was the creation of networks, especially monastic ones, that preserved knowledge, standardized practices, and moved people and ideas across regions. Medieval scriptoria copied texts. Monastic communities tracked seasons, managed estates, and taught novices. Cathedral schools and later universities created a professional class trained in law, theology, medicine, and administration. There's an absurdity here too, depending on your angle. A world that could be intensely superstitious also built systems of rigorous study, debate, and documentation. The comeback is the long horizon. Medieval institutions, at their best, thought in centuries. They built libraries, not feeds. They trained minds for patience. In an age that often feels like it runs on constant urgency, the medieval commitment to slow scholarship is a trend we could use. And then there is medieval public charity, an area where the past can feel both inspiring and uncomfortable. Almsgiving was deeply entwined with religious duty. Hospitals existed, often attached to religious houses, offering care that mixed compassion, social control, and spiritual purpose. The medieval poor were not invisible. They were part of the moral landscape, present at gates, markets, and churches. But medieval charity could also be conditional, judgmental, and tied to ideas about deservingness. The trend worth revisiting isn't medieval moral policing. It's the assumption that society has a collective responsibility to feed and shelter those in need, and that doing so is a visible civic act, not a private afterthought. Finally, no list of medieval trends would be complete without acknowledging the medieval love of spectacle and symbolism. Heraldry turned identity into visual code. Processions turned power into movement. Guilds turned work into community theater, with banners, feasts, patron saints, and public roles. Even the architecture, stone carved into stories, was a kind of media. The absurdity is sometimes in the details. Elaborate rules about who carries what, who stands where, who wears which color. But the historical truth is that medieval society understood something we forget. People need shared rituals. They need ways to feel part of something larger than their household. Not every ritual is healthy, and medieval Europe had plenty of exclusion and coercion. But the hunger for belonging is real. The medieval world met it with public forms. Some beautiful, some oppressive, all revealing. So when a modern title says, absurd medieval trends that need to come back, the real hook isn't nostalgia. It's recognition. The Middle Ages weren't a single dark corridor between Rome and the Renaissance. They were an experimental, improvisational era that built towns, laws, institutions, and everyday habits under pressures we can still understand. Disease, inequality, insecurity, ambition, faith, and the need to make meaning out of limited control. Some medieval trends are worth bringing back as practices: repair culture, communal bathing spaces, public information that reaches people where they live. Some are worth bringing back as lessons: how status hides in fashion, how cities manage night, how institutions can think long-term. And some are worth revisiting simply because they remind us how strange humans can be when they're trying to signal power with a shoe so long it has to be tied to the leg. That strangeness isn't a punchline. It's evidence. It shows us that medieval people were not primitive versions of us. They were fully human, navigating their own systems of pressure and prestige, sometimes with remarkable practicality, sometimes with breathtaking absurdity, and often with both at once. If we look more closely at medieval cities during the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th to 14th centuries, we begin to see something else that feels surprisingly current: walkable urban life built around markets. Weekly markets and annual fairs were not occasional novelties. They were economic engines. Farmers, craftsmen, traders, and merchants converged on designated spaces that were legally protected and often heavily regulated. Weights and measures were inspected. Prices could be monitored. Disputes were heard quickly in special market courts. In other words, commerce was not left entirely to chance. What may sound absurd at first is the sheer level of public involvement in trade. Town authorities cared deeply about bread quality, ale strength, and the fairness of cloth measurements. There were officials specifically tasked with tasting ale or checking loaves. To modern ears, this can sound intrusive or overly paternal. But behind it was a practical goal: stability. In a world where one failed harvest could tip a community into crisis, trust in food supply and trade standards mattered. A possible comeback here is not medieval bureaucracy, but visible accountability in essential goods. Medieval towns understood that food security and honest measurement were not private concerns. They were civic priorities. Guild culture offers another trend that feels both distant and strangely relevant. Medieval guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants who regulated training, quality, and competition within a trade. To join, you typically advanced from apprentice to journeyman to master. The process could take years. It required demonstrated skill, often a masterpiece, to prove competence. On the surface, guilds can look restrictive, even protectionist. They limited entry. They guarded secrets. They enforced standards that sometimes kept prices high. Yet guilds also did something modern economies struggle with. They embedded work within community. A guild was not only a business network. It was a social structure. Members attended religious services together, supported one another in illness, and contributed to charitable causes. Work was not isolated from identity or neighborhood. If there is a medieval trend worth reconsidering, it may be this integration of skill, mentorship, and communal responsibility. The long apprenticeship model, while slow, emphasized depth over speed. It treated expertise as something earned through sustained practice, not just credentialed through short-term certification. Education itself underwent a quiet transformation in the medieval period, particularly with the rise of universities in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. What makes this trend remarkable is not only the subjects taught, law, theology, medicine, philosophy, but the method. Lectures, disputations, structured debates, and commentary on authoritative texts formed a culture of argument. Students and masters engaged in rigorous intellectual exchange within defined rules. This was not a modern research university, but it laid groundwork for one. It may seem absurd that in a time without printing presses for most of the period, students would gather in crowded halls to hear texts read aloud that many could not personally afford to own. But this collective learning environment created shared reference points. Knowledge was social. Ideas were tested in public argument. A comeback here is less about medieval curriculum and more about the discipline of structured disagreement. The medieval university recognized that truth claims needed examination within a community trained to question carefully. Even leisure in the Middle Ages had organized forms that can surprise modern audiences. Public festivals, feast days, and seasonal celebrations punctuated the calendar. The year was not a uniform stretch of work. It moved through rhythms of fasting and feasting, labor and rest. Religious observances shaped this pattern, but the social result was clear. Communities gathered regularly for shared experience. Markets expanded during feast days. Plays were performed. Guilds sponsored pageants. To modern sensibilities, some of these festivals might appear excessive or disruptive. Work paused. Streets filled. Hierarchies could be symbolically inverted for a day. Yet these structured breaks served psychological and social purposes. They released tension. They reaffirmed belonging. In an age when many people feel detached from seasonal rhythms, the medieval calendar reminds us that time can be communal, not only individual. Not every medieval trend deserves revival, of course. Medical practices, for example, were constrained by limited anatomical knowledge and theories such as humoral balance. Treatments could be ineffective or misguided by modern standards. However, even here there is nuance. Medieval hospitals, especially in urban centers, provided organized care spaces. They were often clean by the standards of the time, and they represented an institutional acknowledgement that the sick required shelter and attention. The concept of dedicated care facilities is not uniquely modern. It has medieval precedents. Architecture is another area where medieval trends still quietly influence us. Stone cathedrals and town halls were built not just for function but for endurance. Builders expected their work to last generations. Construction could take decades, even centuries. The apparent absurdity lies in beginning a project you may never see completed. Yet this long-view planning created structures that still define European cityscapes. A comeback worth considering is not medieval ornamentation itself, but the willingness to build with permanence in mind. When we step back, the Middle Ages appear less like a catalogue of oddities and more like a laboratory of social experiments. Some solutions were shaped by scarcity, others by faith or hierarchy. Many were imperfect, but beneath the pointed shoes and strict clothing laws were serious attempts to organize community, manage risk, and signal meaning in uncertain times. The real lesson of these absurd trends is that they were rarely random. They emerged from economic pressure, environmental limits, and human desire for recognition and stability. If we listen carefully, medieval society offers not a blueprint to copy, but a set of questions still worth asking. How do we signal status? How do we regulate fairness? How do we balance individuality with community? And how far should fashion, work, or wealth shape our identity? The answers in the Middle Ages were sometimes strange, but they were never accidental. If we move from towns and institutions into the domestic sphere, medieval daily life reveals another set of trends that feel unexpectedly grounded. Houses, whether modest timber structures or larger stone homes, were often built around a central hall. This was not merely an architectural choice. It reflected a social structure in which much of life was shared. Cooking, eating, receiving guests, conducting business, and sometimes even sleeping took place in overlapping spaces. Privacy, as we define it today, was limited. At first glance, that lack of separation sounds uncomfortable. Modern culture prizes individual rooms and personal boundaries. Yet the medieval hall created constant social awareness. Households were not only nuclear families. They could include servants, apprentices, extended kin, and laborers. The home was an economic unit as much as a private retreat. One possible takeaway is the idea that work and life were integrated rather than sharply divided. While modern remote work echoes this in some ways, medieval households normalized it entirely. The separation of office and home is historically recent. Lighting is another small but revealing detail. Candles and oil lamps were valuable resources. Artificial light was limited and precious. As a result, evenings were structured carefully. People tended to align their routines more closely with daylight. This was not romantic simplicity. It was practical necessity. But it also meant that the rhythm of life was seasonally responsive. Long winter nights were different from summer evenings. A modern comeback here might simply be attentiveness to natural cycles. Medieval people did not ignore environmental limits because they could not. Clothing maintenance offers yet another window into medieval habits. Laundry was labor-intensive. Fabrics like wool were common because they were durable and adaptable to climate. Undergarments were frequently washed, while outer garments were brushed and aired. Contrary to popular myth, cleanliness was not irrelevant. It was managed within technological limits. The broader lesson is one of adaptation. Medieval wardrobes were smaller, but garments were multifunctional. Layers allowed flexibility. In an age of fast fashion, that layered practicality feels almost radical. Food preservation techniques were also central trends. Salting, smoking, pickling, drying, and fermenting were essential methods for extending shelf life. These were not culinary novelties. They were survival strategies. Yet they shaped taste preferences and regional cuisines in lasting ways. Modern interest in fermentation and traditional preservation methods often presents itself as innovation. In reality, it reconnects us with medieval necessity. The comeback here is not nostalgia for scarcity, but respect for food systems designed around storage and seasonality rather than constant abundance. Another medieval feature that feels surprisingly structured is dispute resolution at the local level. Manorial courts, town courts, and guild tribunals handled a wide range of conflicts, from property disagreements to trade complaints. Proceedings were often public. Community members could witness judgments. While these systems were far from perfectly fair and varied widely in effectiveness, they were accessible in ways that modern legal systems sometimes are not. Justice, for better or worse, happened close to home. The apparent absurdity lies in how ordinary these courts were. Legal matters were woven into daily life rather than isolated in distant institutions. A possible lesson is the value of local accountability and visible process. Medieval justice systems were imperfect, but they were embedded within community structure, not hidden behind layers of abstraction. Even communication habits reveal trends worth reconsidering. Letter writing, especially among merchants and clergy, created networks that stretched across regions. Though travel was slow, information could move steadily along trade routes and ecclesiastical channels. Written correspondence preserved agreements, recorded debts, and maintained relationships over distance. It required patience. Replies might take weeks or months. Yet this slower pace did not prevent complex economic coordination. In contrast to instant messaging, medieval correspondence encouraged deliberate expression. Words were chosen carefully because revision was costly and delivery uncertain. The comeback here may be the value of thoughtful communication over immediate reaction. Taken together, these domestic and social trends show a medieval world that was not chaotic or careless. It was structured by limits of light, time, material, and transport. Within those limits, people developed systems that balanced practicality and symbolism. Some of those systems look strange from a modern perspective. Others feel unexpectedly efficient. The Middle Ages were not a golden age, nor were they a cultural void. They were a long negotiation with constraint. Many of the so-called absurd trends make sense once we understand the pressures behind them. And occasionally, those pressures reveal solutions that still resonate: community-centered work, durable goods, seasonal awareness, and visible civic responsibility. When we look closely, the medieval period feels less like a distant curiosity and more like a mirror held at a different angle. If we widen the lens further, medieval travel offers another category of trends that feel both improbable and instructive. Roads were uneven, journeys slow, and dangers real. Yet movement was constant. Pilgrims crossed countries to visit shrines in Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Rome. Merchants traveled between fairs in Champagne or ports along the Mediterranean. Students journeyed to universities far from home. Travel was not casual tourism. It required planning, letters of introduction, and often group protection. One medieval habit that stands out is the infrastructure built around pilgrimage. Hostels, way stations, and hospitals along major routes provided lodging and assistance. These were supported by religious institutions, civic authorities, or private benefactors. At first glance, the idea of organizing large-scale travel around spiritual destinations may seem distant from modern priorities. But the underlying trend is striking. Societies creating support networks for long-distance mobility. Movement was expected, and systems evolved to sustain it. Another travel-related practice worth noting is the issuing of safe-conduct letters. Rulers and authorities could grant documents promising protection to travelers, merchants, or scholars. In an age without centralized national passports as we know them, these letters served as early tools of regulated mobility. They recognized that commerce and knowledge required relative security across political boundaries. The comeback here is not medieval documentation itself, but the recognition that exchange thrives when movement is protected by clear agreements. Medieval environmental management also reveals trends that feel unexpectedly modern. In many regions, forests were regulated resources. Wood was essential for fuel, construction, and tools. Overuse posed real risks. As a result, certain forests were designated with rules controlling grazing, timber cutting, and hunting. While enforcement varied, the awareness of resource limits was present. Communities understood that survival depended on balancing use with regeneration. Agriculture followed similar logic. The three-field system, rotating crops between autumn sowing, spring sowing, and fallow land, was widely adopted in parts of Europe. This method improved soil fertility and reduced the risk of total crop failure. It may not sound dramatic, but it reflects a practical, system-based approach to sustainability within technological constraints. Medieval farmers were not operating with modern science, yet they observed patterns and adjusted methods to stabilize yields. The broader lesson is attentiveness to cycles and adaptation over time. We should also consider medieval record-keeping, a trend that often goes unnoticed. Monasteries, towns, and royal administrations produced charters, account rolls, tax lists, and property records. These documents tracked obligations, rents, and rights. Far from being an unstructured era, the later Middle Ages in particular saw expanding bureaucratic documentation. The absurdity lies in imagining parchment scrolls as ancestors of spreadsheets, yet functionally they served similar purposes, organizing data to manage complex societies. This commitment to written record created continuity. Property claims could be defended through documents. Agreements were formalized. Memory extended beyond living witnesses. A comeback here is not medieval ink and quills, but the seriousness with which documentation was treated. Written records were valuable assets, stored carefully and referenced deliberately. Even medieval attitudes toward risk reveal organized thinking. Insurance contracts appeared in maritime trade by the later Middle Ages, especially in Italian city-states. Merchants invested in ventures knowing that storms, piracy, or political instability could disrupt shipments. Rather than abandoning trade, they developed financial tools to spread risk. This was not a primitive economy. It was a creative response to uncertainty. Taken together, these trends show a medieval world deeply engaged with complexity. Travel required networks. Agriculture required planning. Governance required records. Commerce required risk management. None of this aligns with the outdated image of a static or isolated society. Of course, medieval life also contained severe inequalities, rigid hierarchies, and limited rights by modern standards. Not every system was equitable, but even within those constraints, communities experimented with methods to stabilize their environments and economies. Many of those methods were shaped by necessity rather than ideology. When we look beyond the more theatrical elements, pointed shoes, elaborate feasts, strict clothing laws, we find a quieter set of practices rooted in adaptation. The Middle Ages were sustained by people who observed patterns, created institutions, and refined habits over generations. Some of their solutions may feel distant. Others, once examined closely, seem surprisingly relevant. In that sense, the so-called absurd trends are often only absurd at first glance. Beneath them lies a society constantly negotiating survival, identity, and continuity. And in that negotiation, we can still recognize ourselves. As we move toward the later medieval centuries, especially the 14th and 15th centuries, another set of trends emerges, shaped not by steady growth but by crisis. The Black Death, waves of plague, climate fluctuations during what historians call the Little Ice Age, and recurring wars placed enormous strain on European societies. Yet even in these destabilizing conditions, medieval communities did not simply collapse. They adapted, sometimes in ways that appear unexpectedly modern. One striking development after the Black Death was the shifting value of labor. With large portions of the population lost to disease, surviving workers in many regions found themselves in higher demand. Wages rose in some areas, and governments responded by attempting to freeze pay rates through legislation. England's Statute of Labourers in 1351 is one well-known example. On the surface, this appears as an early attempt at wage control that feels rigid and unfair. Yet the broader context reveals something important. Medieval authorities recognized that labor markets could shift dramatically under demographic pressure. They attempted, however imperfectly, to regulate economic imbalance. The lesson here is not admiration for restrictive law, but acknowledgement that societies have long grappled with wage instability, worker mobility, and bargaining power. Medieval responses were shaped by hierarchy and fear of disorder, yet they reflect a recognition that economic change requires policy response. Urban planning also evolved during and after periods of crisis. Repeated outbreaks of disease encouraged closer attention to sanitation. While medieval understandings of contagion were limited, practical measures were implemented in some cities. Quarantine rules for ships, isolation of the sick, and oversight of waste disposal. Italian port cities such as Venice developed structured quarantine systems in the 15th century, including designated isolation facilities known as lazarettos. The term itself reflects institutional thinking around public health. To modern ears, quarantine is not a medieval curiosity. It is a familiar tool. What is remarkable is that even without germ theory, authorities observed patterns and responded with organized intervention. The comeback worth considering is not medieval medicine, but the principle of coordinated public health grounded in observation and shared responsibility. Another trend accelerated by late medieval pressures was technological refinement. Improvements in mechanical clocks, for example, changed how time was measured and experienced. Public clock towers began to appear in town centers, standardizing hours in a way that earlier bell-based systems did not. This shift subtly transformed urban life. Work schedules, market hours, and civic routines could be synchronized more precisely. At first glance, this may not seem like a trend in the cultural sense, but standardized time altered social expectation. It introduced greater predictability and discipline into daily life. Medieval society was not static. It embraced innovations that reshaped behavior. The clock tower, rising above a marketplace, symbolized coordination as much as craftsmanship. Meanwhile, artistic and intellectual trends were shifting as well. Late medieval devotional culture increasingly emphasized personal reflection. Books of hours, private prayer books often richly illustrated, became popular among the literate laity. This trend points toward a growing interiority within religious life. Faith was not only communal ritual, it also became personal practice supported by portable texts. The production of these books depended on skilled scribes and illuminators, and later benefited from the advent of printing technology in the 15th century. The printing press did not instantly replace manuscript culture, but it accelerated the spread of standardized texts. Information could circulate more widely and consistently. A A comeback lesson here is not a return to parchment, but respect for how technological shifts alter access to knowledge and reshape communities of belief and learning. Even warfare, though destructive, drove organizational trends. Armies required logistics, financing, and coordination across regions. This fostered more centralized administrative structures in some kingdoms. Record-keeping expanded. Tax systems became more systematic. While these developments were often burdensome for populations, they contributed to the emergence of more structured state institutions. What becomes clear in the later medieval world is that adaptation was constant. Crisis forced experimentation. Demographic shock reshaped labor. Disease prompted public health measures. Technology refined timekeeping and communication. Devotional culture encouraged personal literacy. Administration became more detailed. These were not isolated anomalies. They were responses to lived realities. The Middle Ages did not simply drift toward the Renaissance. They actively reorganized themselves under pressure. Some of those reorganizations laid foundations for early modern states, economies, and educational systems. When we reflect on absurd medieval trends, it is tempting to focus only on the visible oddities. Yet the deeper story is one of resilience. Medieval societies absorbed shock and recalibrated structures. They were capable of institutional learning, even within limited scientific frameworks. In that sense, the medieval period offers more than curiosity. It demonstrates that adaptation under constraint is not new. Communities have long faced uncertainty and responded with new rules, tools, and habits. And sometimes those responses, quarantine systems, labor negotiations, standardized time, organized record-keeping, feel less like relics and more like enduring frameworks. The Middle Ages, far from being frozen in place, were constantly in motion. As the medieval period drew closer to its end, what becomes most striking is not how different the world was, but how recognizably human its priorities remained. Across centuries marked by war, disease, devotion, and innovation, people consistently tried to create stability through shared norms. Some of those norms now appear theatrical or excessive. Others feel quietly practical. Together, they form a record of adaptation rather than absurdity. Consider reputation. In medieval society, reputation was not a vague personal concern. It was a form of social currency. Credit, marriage prospects, guild membership, and political influence all depended on perceived honor. Public oaths carried enormous weight. Slander could lead to legal action. Community testimony shaped outcomes in local courts. While modern societies rely heavily on formal contracts and digital records, medieval communities relied on visible character within a relatively small social world. At first glance, this reliance on reputation might seem fragile, but it also created accountability embedded in everyday interaction. A merchant who cheated customers could be excluded from trade networks. A craftsman who failed to meet standards risked losing guild support. The lesson is not to romanticize social pressure, which could be harsh and unforgiving, but to recognize how deeply trust underpinned economic and civic life. Medieval systems worked because relationships were ongoing and memory was long. Hospitality was another deeply rooted expectation. Travelers, pilgrims, and even strangers could appeal to customs of shelter and food, especially through religious houses or established inns. In a world without centralized emergency services, hospitality functioned as an informal safety net. It was reinforced by religious teaching, but also by practical recognition that anyone might someday be the traveler in need. We might see echoes of this in modern disaster response or community aid networks. Medieval hospitality was not universal or without limits, yet it reflected a shared understanding that mobility and vulnerability were common human experiences. Even medieval humor and entertainment reveal structured patterns rather than chaos. Traveling performers, storytellers, and musicians moved between towns. Mystery plays dramatized religious narratives in public spaces. These performances were not random diversions. They were often organized by guilds or municipal authorities. They required coordination, funding, rehearsal, and staging. The apparent absurdity, entire towns staging elaborate biblical cycles over several days, was actually a demonstration of logistical capability. Communities invested in shared storytelling. The boundary between education and entertainment was thin. Audiences learned doctrine, history, and moral lessons through public drama. While the content reflected its time, the format shows that large-scale cultural production did not begin with modern media. Architecture continued to serve as a visible statement of continuity. Late medieval towns invested in walls, bridges, market halls, and churches that anchored civic identity. Construction projects could span generations, funded by donations, taxes, or guild contributions. Participation in building campaigns reinforced communal belonging. Even those who contributed small amounts were symbolically tied to the finished structure. This long-term investment challenges the idea that medieval life was only short-term survival. People planned beyond their own lifetimes. They contributed to projects whose completion they might never witness. That orientation toward legacy is perhaps one of the most compelling medieval trends of all. It is important, however, not to flatten the period into harmony. Social tensions were constant. Peasant revolts, urban uprisings, and factional conflicts revealed deep dissatisfaction with inequality and taxation. Yet even these moments of unrest demonstrate engagement with political structures. Petitioners articulated grievances in formal language. They invoked customary rights. They appealed to principles of fairness embedded in local tradition. The Middle Ages were not silent. They were argumentative. Communities negotiated power within inherited frameworks. That negotiation shaped evolving legal and political norms that would influence later centuries. So when we revisit medieval trends, what we uncover is less a list of eccentric habits and more a landscape of responses. Clothing laws reflected anxiety about status mobility. Guild systems balanced quality control with community identity. Public health measures emerged from observation. Agricultural rotation reflected environmental awareness. Festivals structured time and reinforced belonging. Some practices remain firmly in the past, shaped by conditions we no longer share. Others, once examined carefully, appear less alien. They remind us that history is not a linear march from ignorance to sophistication. It is a series of adaptations, each embedded in context. The medieval world faced uncertainty without modern technology, yet it built networks, institutions, and cultural systems that endured. Its trends, practical, symbolic, sometimes excessive, were tools for navigating complexity. And perhaps that is the most enduring takeaway. The Middle Ages were not defined by absurdity. They were defined by effort. The effort to regulate markets, to preserve knowledge, to manage risk, to honor belief, to maintain reputation, and to leave something standing for the next generation. When we look past the caricatures, we find not a distant curiosity, but a society engaged in the same fundamental task that occupies us today, organizing human life under constraint and searching for meaning within it. As we bring this exploration to a close, it becomes clear that what we label as absurd in the medieval world often reveals more about modern assumptions than about medieval reality. Distance exaggerates difference. A pointed shoe, a sumptuary law, or a public proclamation can seem theatrical when separated from its context. Yet within that context, each was part of a functioning system, sometimes flawed, sometimes effective, always intentional. The medieval period stretched across roughly 1,000 years. Within that span, climates shifted, populations rose and fell, kingdoms expanded and fractured, and technologies advanced. It was not a static age suspended between ancient and modern. It was transitional, adaptive, and internally diverse. Trends emerged not because people were naive, but because they were responding to pressures we can still recognize. Scarcity, ambition, insecurity, faith, competition, and hope. One of the most powerful medieval habits was collective memory. Chronicles recorded local events alongside royal affairs. Monasteries preserved charters that defined land rights for generations. Oral traditions carried stories of conflict and cooperation. Memory was not nostalgia. It was infrastructure. It anchored claims, identity, and authority. In a world without cloud storage or digital archives, preservation required deliberate effort. That seriousness about memory shaped behavior. Actions were taken with awareness that they might be recorded, retold, or judged by future generations. Modern societies often assume rapid turnover of trends, leaders, technologies. Medieval culture, by contrast, placed weight on continuity. Even innovation was often framed as restoration of older rites or customs. Change was negotiated through reference to precedent. Another defining feature of medieval life was interdependence. No household was entirely self-sufficient. Farmers relied on blacksmiths. Blacksmiths relied on charcoal burners. Towns relied on surrounding countryside for grain and livestock. Monasteries managed estates that supported both religious and lay communities. The boundaries between sacred and secular, rural and urban, economic and spiritual, were permeable. This interdependence required cooperation, even amid hierarchy. Agreements were formalized through oath and ceremony. Disputes were settled through layered courts. Alliances were reinforced through marriage or guild membership. While power imbalances were real, society functioned through networks rather than isolation. If there is a modern resonance here, it lies in recognizing that complex systems depend on trust and coordination. Medieval people understood, often instinctively, that survival required collaboration across roles. Their tools were different from ours, but the principle remains familiar. It is also worth reflecting on medieval attitudes toward craftsmanship and durability. Buildings were constructed with materials intended to last. Tools were maintained and repaired. Skills were transmitted through apprenticeship over years, not weeks. This was partly necessity. Resources were limited, but it also fostered respect for process. A cathedral arch or a forged blade represented accumulated knowledge. Mastery was visible. In a culture increasingly oriented toward speed and replacement, that medieval patience stands out. It reminds us that quality is often the product of time invested consistently. Of course, the Middle Ages contained injustice, exclusion, and hardship. Social mobility was constrained. Literacy was unevenly distributed. Disease could devastate entire regions. Yet even within these limitations, communities sought order. They codified customs, trained successors, preserved documents, and built institutions. When we look back at medieval trends, whether in fashion, governance, architecture, or daily routine, we are really examining strategies for coping with uncertainty. Some strategies now seem inefficient or symbolic. Others appear surprisingly pragmatic. All of them emerged from real human needs. The temptation to dismiss the Middle Ages as irrational overlooks the sophistication embedded in its systems. Medieval society developed financial instruments, regulated trade, formalized education, organized healthcare spaces, and constructed public works that endure to this day. It experimented constantly, even when constrained by belief systems very different from ours. Perhaps the most meaningful trend to bring forward is not any single practice, but the mindset of adaptation within limits. Medieval communities did not control their environment completely. They worked within it. They built networks of obligation and support. They marked time with shared rituals. They invested in memory and legacy. In doing so, they left behind more than castles and manuscripts. They left a record of resilience. And when we examine that record carefully, we see that beneath the surface oddities lies a society engaged in thoughtful, often creative problem-solving. The Middle Ages were never just a backdrop between better-known eras. They were a long, evolving chapter of human organization. And in their experiments, some successful, some flawed, we can still trace the outlines of our own concerns. Fairness, identity, stability, meaning, and the desire to be remembered. That continuity, more than any single trend, is what makes the medieval world worth revisiting. Before we fully step away from the medieval world, it's worth pausing on one final theme that runs quietly through nearly every trend we've explored: visibility. Medieval society was highly visible. Status was visible in clothing. Authority was visible in architecture. Law was visible in public courts. Faith was visible in ritual and procession. Even punishment and celebration were often staged in shared spaces. This visibility served practical purposes. In a largely face-to-face society, systems worked best when they could be seen and understood. A market scale inspected in public reinforced trust. A guild banner carried in procession affirmed professional identity. A clock tower overlooking a square reminded everyone that time was now measured collectively. Visibility made structures tangible. In contrast, much of modern life operates invisibly, through digital systems, distant institutions, and abstract processes. Medieval society reminds us that when structures are visible, they shape behavior more directly. A town wall was not merely symbolic. It defined the boundary of protection and obligation. A cathedral was not just a building. It was a statement of shared investment rising above daily life. Another powerful medieval pattern was continuity through ritual. Life events, birth, marriage, death were marked with communal acknowledgement. Agricultural cycles were tied to feast days and fasting seasons. Even political transitions were wrapped in ceremony. These rituals were not empty repetition. They stabilized expectation in uncertain environments. It is easy to dismiss ritual as outdated formality. Yet ritual functions as social glue. It gives structure to change. Medieval people understood that continuity required visible markers. When harvest failed or plague returned, the calendar still turned. Feast followed fast. Bells still rang. In that rhythm, communities found reassurance. We can also reflect on medieval approaches to knowledge transmission beyond universities. Craft knowledge passed from master to apprentice was embodied learning. Agricultural knowledge moved through generations by practice rather than textbooks. Oral storytelling preserved local history where written records were sparse. Knowledge was not separated from the people who carried it. That personal transmission created responsibility. To forget a technique or misapply a method had real consequences. Modern knowledge systems are vast and distributed, but sometimes detached from lived experience. Medieval life tied knowledge to accountability within community. Even medieval limitations reveal something instructive. Travel was slow, communication delayed, resources finite. Yet within those limits, people created trade networks spanning continents. They negotiated treaties, developed credit systems, and built urban centers that drew migrants from across regions. Constraint did not prevent ambition. It redirected it. If we consider fashion again, those exaggerated shoes, layered garments, carefully restricted fabrics, they tell us something enduring about human behavior. People signal belonging and aspiration through appearance. Medieval societies codified this impulse more overtly than we do, but the impulse itself has not changed. The lesson is less about copying medieval aesthetics and more about recognizing that symbols of identity always carry social meaning. In architecture, in law, in markets, in ritual, the medieval world shows a deep awareness of structure. Life was organized deliberately, even when shaped by inequality or belief systems far removed from ours. Communities sought coherence. They valued durability. They recorded agreements. They gathered publicly. What ultimately defines the Middle Ages is not darkness or absurdity, but negotiation between scarcity and creativity, between hierarchy and cooperation, between continuity and change. Trends rose and faded, but underlying them was a constant effort to maintain order and meaning. When we look back with patience rather than caricature, the medieval period feels less alien. Is people worried about fairness in trade, stability in work, clarity in law, and memory across generations? They experimented with solutions available to them. Some now appear impractical. Others feel surprisingly transferable. The pointed shoes may remain in history books. Sumptuary laws may stay firmly in the past. But repair culture, long-term building, community accountability, seasonal awareness, and visible civic life, these are not relics. They are reminders. The medieval world does not offer a blueprint to replicate. It offers perspective. It shows that complexity did not begin with modern technology. It shows that adaptation under pressure is an ancient skill. And it shows that even in centuries often labeled dark, people were building systems designed to last. In the end, the most valuable medieval trend might simply be this: the determination to organize society thoughtfully within the limits of its time. That determination, across 1,000 years, shaped a world far more intricate and resilient than the caricature suggests. As we reflect one last time on the medieval world, it becomes clear that the phrase absurd trends is often a doorway rather than a conclusion. It invites curiosity. Why did people regulate clothing so strictly? Why build shoes that hinder movement? Why stage elaborate public rituals? But once those questions are asked seriously, the answers rarely point to irrationality. They point to structure. Medieval societies operated without many of the technological buffers we rely on today. There were no instant supply chains, no centralized welfare states, no rapid medical interventions. In that environment, order had to be reinforced socially and symbolically. Clothing signaled hierarchy because hierarchy structured responsibility. Ritual reinforced belief because belief unified communities across literacy gaps. Public courts and proclamations ensured that law was heard as well as written. Even the medieval fascination with heraldry, coats of arms carefully designed, recorded, and displayed, served a practical function. In battlefields crowded with armor and banners, visual identity mattered. In diplomatic and legal contexts, heraldic symbols authenticated documents and alliances. What might seem decorative was deeply administrative. The same principle applies to medieval pageantry. Royal entries into cities were choreographed events. Guilds marched in order. Streets were decorated. Speeches were delivered. These occasions reinforced loyalty and mutual obligation between rulers and towns. They were political communication in an age before mass media. The spectacle was not frivolous. It was functional. We should also remember that medieval life was intensely local. Identity was often rooted in village, parish, or town. That local focus created strong communal bonds but could also foster exclusion. Still, the strength of local identity supported systems of mutual aid and shared responsibility. When harvest failed or fire struck, neighbors were the first responders. This localization also meant that trends spread gradually. Innovations in agriculture, architecture, or governance moved along trade routes or through institutional networks. Change was visible in stages. That slower diffusion allowed adaptation over time rather than instant upheaval. There is something steady about that rhythm of transformation. It is tempting to measure the medieval period by what it lacked: modern medicine, industrial production, democratic governance as we understand it. Yet such comparisons can obscure what it achieved. Over centuries, medieval Europe constructed universities that still exist, legal frameworks that influenced common and civil law traditions, and urban infrastructures that shaped modern city planning. None of this erases the hardship or inequality present in the period. Serfdom restricted mobility for many. Women's rights were limited in most contexts. Religious conformity was often enforced strictly. But within these constraints, individuals and communities carved out spaces of negotiation. Charters granted towns certain freedoms. Guild membership offered economic pathways. Monastic life provided education and authority for some women otherwise excluded from formal power. The medieval world was not frozen. It was layered. Old customs coexisted with emerging institutions. Oral tradition blended with written documentation. Sacred and secular authority overlapped and sometimes competed. That layered complexity resists caricature. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from medieval trends is that systems matter. Whether in fashion, law, agriculture, or ritual practices were embedded in broader frameworks. A pointed shoe was not just footwear. It was a statement within a hierarchy. A market regulation was not mere fussiness. It was part of economic stabilization. A festival was not random celebration. It was social cohesion enacted publicly. When we revisit the Middle Ages with patience, the so-called absurdities soften into context. We begin to see intention where we once saw oddity. We see adaptation where we expected stagnation. And we recognize that every era, including our own, develops habits that future generations may find equally strange. History has a way of humbling assumptions. The medieval period reminds us that progress is not a straight line and that sophistication can exist without modern tools. It shows that communities have long grappled with inequality, risk, identity, and resilience. They responded with the resources available to them. In the end, the Middle Ages offer not a catalog of curiosities, but a long record of organized human effort. Beneath the surface of dramatic fashion and elaborate ceremony lies a society deeply invested in continuity, accountability, and meaning. And perhaps that is the most important perspective to carry forward. That even in centuries often misunderstood, people were building, regulating, learning, adapting, and remembering. The trends may look different, but the underlying impulse to create order in an uncertain world remains profoundly familiar. If we take one final, steady look at the medieval landscape, what stands out is how intentional it all was. The clothing, the rituals, the markets, the courts, the guilds, none of these were random cultural accidents. They were frameworks built to manage uncertainty in a world where uncertainty was constant. The medieval economy, for instance, depended heavily on predictability. Harvest cycles determined food supply. Trade routes depended on seasonal winds and political stability. Labor fluctuated with disease and war. In response, medieval communities developed habits that reinforced steadiness. Market days were fixed. Fairs were scheduled annually. Religious calendars structured time in reliable patterns. Even fasting seasons served economic functions, reducing strain on certain food supplies at predictable intervals. From a modern distance, it may seem strange that religion structured so much of daily life. But in practical terms, the shared calendar provided coordination across regions. When everyone observed the same feast days and fasts, economic and social rhythms aligned. This synchronization reduced friction, created shared expectations. Medieval architecture tells a similar story. Stone bridges replaced wooden ones not only for prestige, but for durability. Town walls were repaired and expanded as populations grew. Watermills and windmills harnessed natural energy sources to reduce manual labor. These were not glamorous innovations, yet they reflect careful investment in infrastructure. Water management, in particular, reveals a pragmatic mindset. Medieval towns developed systems of wells, conduits, and drainage channels. While sanitation standards varied widely, there was awareness that water access and waste control affected health and productivity. Urban ordinances addressed the disposal of refuse and the maintenance of streets. Again, the methods were limited by contemporary knowledge, but the intention to regulate and improve living conditions was present. Another enduring medieval pattern was layered authority. Power did not flow neatly from a single centralized source. Kings, nobles, bishops, guild leaders, and town councils each held influence in overlapping domains. This could lead to conflict, but it also created negotiation. Rights were often defined through charters. Towns bargained for privileges. Nobles swore oaths of loyalty in exchange for protection. This web of obligation was complex, yet complexity itself functioned as a stabilizer. Multiple centers of authority prevented any single force from entirely dominating daily life in many contexts. The system was imperfect and frequently unequal, but it was dynamic rather than rigidly monolithic. Even medieval warfare, often remembered only for brutality, required organization and planning. Castles were engineered with strategic foresight. Supply lines had to be maintained. Alliances were negotiated through diplomacy as much as through force. The logistics behind conflict demanded administrative competence. Cultural production, too, required coordination. Manuscript illumination involved scribes, artists, parchment makers, and patrons. Cathedral construction required architects, masons, laborers, and financiers working across decades. These collaborative efforts reveal a society capable of sustained, collective enterprise. Perhaps what feels most distant about medieval trends is their overt symbolism. Modern societies often prefer subtle signals. Medieval communities, by contrast, made symbolism visible and public. Clothing, banners, architecture, and ceremony communicated identity and allegiance clearly. Ambiguity was reduced through display. Yet even this preference for visibility served order. In a world where literacy was not universal, symbols carried meaning efficiently. They allowed individuals to recognize status, authority, and affiliation at a glance. As we close this long exploration, the medieval period appears less as an age of oddities and more as an age of structure. Its trends, some practical, some theatrical, were responses to environmental limits, technological constraints, and social hierarchies. They were shaped by faith, necessity, ambition, and fear. And perhaps that is the final insight. Every era develops practices that later generations will question. What seems natural now may look absurd centuries from today. The Middle Ages remind us that context matters. Practices arise from need. Systems evolve under pressure. The people of the medieval world were not waiting for modernity to rescue them. They were building systems that worked as best they could within their time. They repaired what broke. They regulated what threatened stability. They recorded what needed memory. They gathered to mark seasons and transitions. In doing so, they left behind a record not of darkness, but of determination. And when we study their so-called trends with patience, we find less absurdity than intention, less strangeness than structure. The Middle Ages endure not because of pointed shoes or strict clothing laws, but because of the institutions, habits, and collective efforts that carried communities forward across 1,000 years of change. As we reach the quiet end of this journey, it's worth stepping back and asking a simple question. Why do medieval trends fascinate us at all? Part of the answer lies in contrast. The Middle Ages feel distant enough to be strange, yet close enough to be recognizable. The castles still stand. The street plans of old cities still shape modern maps. Universities founded in the medieval period still educate students today. The continuity makes the differences more noticeable. But fascination also comes from misunderstanding. For generations, the medieval era was labeled as backward or stagnant, especially in comparison to the classical world before it or the Renaissance that followed. That framing encouraged a search for absurdity. If the period was dark, then its habits must have been irrational. Yet the more historians examine records, architecture, legal documents, and material culture, the more that caricature dissolves. Medieval Europe was deeply interconnected through trade routes stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean and beyond. Financial instruments developed in Italian city-states influenced wider commerce. Diplomatic correspondence crossed linguistic and political boundaries. Even rural communities were tied into broader economic systems. This interconnectedness shaped trends in subtle ways. Fashion did not remain isolated in one region. Textiles moved along trade networks. Spices altered cuisine. Architectural styles spread through skilled laborers traveling between projects. What might appear as a local eccentricity often reflected broader exchange. Another enduring feature of medieval society was its layered sense of belonging. People identified with family, parish, town, guild, and kingdom simultaneously. These overlapping identities created resilience. If one layer faltered, others could provide support. A guild might assist a member in hardship. Parish might coordinate charity. A town council might negotiate privileges with a monarch. This structure did not eliminate inequality or conflict. Tensions between classes, regions, and religious groups were real and sometimes violent. Yet the framework of shared institutions provided channels for negotiation. Medieval society was argumentative, but it was also organized. It's also important to remember that medieval people were not unaware of their own past. They studied classical texts, preserved Roman law traditions in certain regions, and referenced earlier authorities in theological and philosophical debates. The idea that medieval culture was cut off from antiquity is inaccurate. Instead, it reinterpreted inherited knowledge within new contexts. Innovation, therefore, often appeared gradual rather than revolutionary. Agricultural improvements accumulated slowly. Architectural techniques refined over decades. Legal practices evolved through precedent. The absence of rapid industrial change does not mean the absence of progress. It means progress operated at a different tempo. And tempo may be one of the most meaningful contrasts between then and now. Medieval life unfolded at a pace governed by seasons, daylight, and the limits of travel. That pace allowed for continuity. Buildings were constructed over generations. Traditions persisted long enough to anchor identity. Change, when it came, was absorbed into existing frameworks. When we describe medieval trends as absurd, we often focus on their visual or symbolic elements. But when we look beneath the surface, we find coherence. Sumptuary laws reflected anxiety about social mobility. Guild regulations protected standards in fragile markets. Public rituals reinforced collective memory. Even exaggerated fashion served as a readable language of hierarchy. The deeper pattern is adaptation. Medieval communities constantly adjusted to environmental stress, demographic change, and political conflict. They refined systems of governance, education, and trade without the tools we consider essential today. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from the medieval world is humility. It reminds us that sophistication does not depend solely on technology. Organization, foresight, and resilience can exist in any era. The tools differ, but the human capacity to structure society endures. Centuries from now, future observers may look back at our habits, our digital rituals, our fashion cycles, our bureaucratic systems, and find them equally peculiar. Context will shape their judgment, just as it shapes ours when we study the Middle Ages. In the end, medieval trends are not relics of irrationality. They are traces of people working within constraint, crafting order from uncertainty, and building institutions that would outlast them. When viewed carefully, the period offers not a gallery of oddities, but a long testament to human adaptability. And that adaptability, more than any single practice, is the thread that connects their world to ours. If there is one final perspective worth holding on to, it is this: the medieval world was not trying to be modern. It was trying to be stable. Its trends, customs, and institutions were built to answer immediate needs while preserving long-term continuity. That balance between present necessity and future security shaped nearly every aspect of life. Take inheritance practices as one example. Land was the foundation of wealth and survival. Rules governing who inherited property were carefully structured to prevent fragmentation or dispute. In some regions, primogeniture concentrated estates in the hands of the eldest son. In others, land was divided among heirs. These systems reflected different priorities, either maintaining concentrated power or distributing resources among family members. What may appear rigid today was, in context, an attempt to avoid instability. Similarly, marriage was rarely treated as a purely romantic union. It functioned as an economic and social alliance. Dowries, property exchanges, and family negotiations ensured that households remained viable. While modern audiences may find the transactional nature of medieval marriage uncomfortable, it reveals a society deeply aware of interdependence. Survival often depended on well-structured alliances. Even medieval leisure had an organized quality. Hunting, for example, was not merely recreation for the elite. It reinforced social hierarchy, land rights, and martial skill. Forest laws regulated who could hunt and where. The symbolism of the hunt, discipline, hierarchy, coordination, mirrored broader social structures. What looks like pastime was intertwined with governance and identity. On a more ordinary level, medieval households practiced routines that maximized limited resources. Bread ovens were communal in many towns. Baking was scheduled carefully to conserve fuel. Brewing ale at home was common because safe drinking water could not always be guaranteed. These were not charming rustic details. They were rational responses to technological limits. Trade, too, relied on trust networks rather than impersonal systems. Merchant families often operated across generations, maintaining correspondence and financial partnerships through kinship ties. Reputation functioned as collateral. Without modern banking infrastructure, credibility was currency. The medieval emphasis on oath and honor may feel archaic, but it sustained economic exchange over distance. It is also important to recognize the diversity within the medieval experience. Urban centers differed sharply from rural villages. Coastal trading hubs operated differently from inland agricultural regions. The Middle Ages were not uniform. Trends that dominated in Florence might never appear in a northern village. Recognizing this variation prevents oversimplification. Over time, The accumulation of small adjustments created significant transformation. Agricultural yields improved through experimentation. Urban governance became more sophisticated. Educational institutions formalized curricula. These shifts were incremental, but they laid groundwork for the early modern period. When modern audiences label certain medieval habits as absurd, it often reflects discomfort with visible hierarchy or overt symbolism. Today, status may be conveyed more subtly, yet it remains present. Medieval society simply displayed it openly. Rank was embroidered into clothing, carved into stone, and proclaimed in ceremony. The openness of that signaling made social structures clear, if not equal. One always knew where one stood. That clarity could be restrictive, but it reduced ambiguity. In contrast, modern societies often mask hierarchy behind narratives of fluid mobility. As we conclude this extended reflection, what emerges most strongly is coherence. The medieval period was held together by systems, legal, economic, religious, and cultural, that evolved to meet specific challenges. Some of those systems now seem unfamiliar. Others persist in altered forms. Cathedrals still anchor city skylines. Universities still organize knowledge. Legal traditions still cite precedents. Market regulations still aim to protect fairness. Even seasonal festivals survive in modified forms. The Middle Ages were not an interruption between greatness and progress. They were a millennium of structured adaptation. Their trends, whether in fashion, governance, or daily life, were expressions of deeper efforts to maintain order and meaning. If we listen carefully, beyond the caricatures, we hear a society thinking, organizing, and building with the tools it possessed. And in that careful effort, we find something enduringly human: the desire to create stability in a changing world. That desire, across centuries, remains constant. In the quietest sense, the medieval world teaches us something about endurance. Not dramatic endurance in the face of singular catastrophe, but steady endurance across generations. The systems we've explored, guilds, markets, rituals, agricultural cycles, layered authority, were not designed for short-term spectacle. They were meant to hold. One of the most understated medieval trends was record continuity. Monastic annals were updated year after year, sometimes in the same hand, sometimes by successive scribes. Town councils kept rolls of decisions. Royal administrations preserved tax accounts. These documents were rarely glamorous. They were lists, notes, confirmations. Yet together they created institutional memory. Institutional memory allowed communities to function beyond individual lifetimes. A charter granted decades earlier could still be invoked. A boundary described in an old record could settle a new dispute. Medieval society, often perceived as fragile, relied heavily on continuity through documentation. That quiet habit of writing things down and preserving them carefully stabilized governance. There was also continuity in craft. Techniques for stone vaulting, metal forging, manuscript illumination, and shipbuilding passed through apprenticeship chains that stretched across centuries. Innovations occurred, but rarely by abandoning prior knowledge completely. Instead, medieval artisans built upon inherited methods. That layered accumulation of skill produced remarkable results. Cathedrals with soaring arches, intricate stained glass, durable fortifications. This approach to mastery required patience. Apprenticeships were long. Advancement was gradual. Skill was demonstrated publicly before acceptance into mastery. The pace may seem slow by modern standards, yet it cultivated depth. Craft was not disposable. It was identity. Medieval time itself was experienced as layered rather than linear. The past was not distant. It was authoritative. Biblical history, Roman legacy, local founding myths, all coexisted in collective imagination. Decisions were framed in reference to tradition. Even reforms were often presented as restorations of older, purer practice. This respect for precedent did not prevent change. Instead, it shaped how change was justified. By anchoring innovation in continuity, medieval societies reduced social shock. Transformation appeared evolutionary rather than abrupt. Another subtle but powerful trend was communal obligation. In villages and towns, individuals owed duties, labor services, taxes, militia participation, maintenance of roads or walls. These obligations were not always welcomed, but they reinforced the idea that survival was shared. Infrastructure did not maintain itself. Defense required coordination. Harvest required cooperation. The visible performance of obligation, working on fortifications, attending court sessions, participating in guild duties, reinforced belonging. Medieval identity was rarely solitary. It was relational. Even in intellectual life, continuity shaped inquiry. Scholars engaged deeply with authoritative texts, commenting on and debating them rather than discarding them outright. This method could appear conservative, yet it cultivated analytical discipline. Arguments were structured carefully within established frameworks. Over time, those debates refined legal reasoning and theological thought. It is tempting to romanticize the medieval period as cohesive and unified. It was not. Conflict, famine, war, and disease disrupted stability repeatedly. But what stands out is how often institutions endured beyond crisis. Town charters survived upheaval. Guilds adapted membership rules. Agricultural patterns shifted but did not collapse entirely. Resilience came not from eliminating uncertainty, but from embedding response mechanisms within daily life. Market inspections, seasonal calendars, apprenticeship systems, layered courts, these were buffers against chaos. When we step back from individual absurd details and look at the structure beneath them, the medieval period appears less alien. It reveals a civilization deeply invested in order, continuity, and mutual reliance. Its symbols were bold, its hierarchies visible, its rituals frequent, but all served to reinforce structure. Perhaps the greatest misconception about the Middle Ages is that it was static. In truth, it was dynamic within constraint. Change occurred, but it moved through established channels. Innovation was tested against tradition. Authority was negotiated across layers. As modern observers, we may not wish to replicate medieval systems wholesale, nor should we ignore their inequalities and limitations. But we can recognize the sophistication embedded in their persistence. Across 1,000 years, medieval communities kept building, recording, negotiating, repairing, and adapting. They did so without modern machinery, without instant communication, without centralized bureaucracies as we know them. Yet they sustained complex societies. In that long endurance lies the most compelling medieval trend of all: the quiet determination to maintain structure, even when the world felt uncertain. And perhaps the most fitting way to close is not with another example, but with a shift in perspective. When we look at the medieval world through the lens of absurd trends, we are really engaging in a kind of comparison exercise. We are placing our own assumptions about efficiency, freedom, fashion, governance, and identity beside those of a society separated from us by centuries. The contrast can feel dramatic, but contrast is not the same as superiority. Medieval Europe operated within tight material limits. Energy came from muscle, wind, and water. Information traveled at the speed of horse or ship. Illness could not be treated with antibiotics. Yet within those constraints, people built trade networks stretching across continents, constructed cathedrals that still dominate skylines, organized universities that shaped intellectual history, and developed legal traditions that continue to influence courts today. What we sometimes call absurd was often simply visible structure. Hierarchy was explicit rather than implied. Belief was communal rather than private. Obligation was performed publicly rather than abstracted into distant institutions. These features can seem uncomfortable to modern sensibilities, but they made society legible to its participants. Legibility is an underrated concept. In medieval towns, you could see authority in stone buildings and ceremonial processions. You could see economic order in guild halls and market inspections. You could see time marked by bells and public clocks. The system, for all its imperfections, was tangible. In contrast, many modern systems are opaque. Financial networks operate invisibly. Algorithms shape information quietly. Governance often feels distant. The medieval world reminds us that visibility can foster accountability, even if it also reinforces hierarchy. Another enduring theme is scale. Medieval communities functioned primarily at local or regional scale, even when connected by broader networks. Decisions were often made by people known to those affected. Conflicts unfolded among neighbors rather than anonymous entities. That scale shaped behavior. Reputation mattered because relationships were ongoing. Modern life operates at massive scale, national, global, digital. While this scale offers efficiency and opportunity, it can dilute personal accountability. Medieval society, for better and worse, kept interactions closer to home. There is also something instructive in the medieval acceptance of limits. Seasons could not be hurried. Crops required time. Apprenticeship required years. Construction spanned generations. While hardship often forced patience, patience also cultivated endurance. Today, acceleration defines much of our experience. Innovation cycles move quickly. Information updates constantly. The medieval rhythm, though shaped by necessity, fostered long-term thinking. Cathedrals were begun with the understanding that completion might lie beyond the lifetime of the original builders. That orientation toward legacy is difficult in a culture driven by immediate results. And yet, despite slower pace and limited technology, medieval societies were not static. They adapted to plague with quarantine systems. They responded to labor shortages with legal adjustments. They refined agricultural methods and financial tools. They experimented with forms of governance that balanced monarchy, nobility, and urban autonomy. The Middle Ages were not a pause in history. They were a long chapter of experimentation within constraint. If there is a single thread connecting the trends we've explored, fashion excess, guild systems, public ritual, record-keeping, architectural ambition, it is the search for stability and meaning. Medieval people wanted their world to make sense. They wanted clear signals of identity, reliable markets, structured time, preserved memory, and institutions that would outlast them. Those desires have not changed. Centuries from now, observers may look back at our own era and question our digital fashions, our bureaucratic rituals, our architectural choices, and our economic systems. They may find our habits equally strange. Context will shape their judgment, just as it shapes ours. The medieval world, when examined carefully, offers less a list of oddities than a reminder of continuity. Human beings across time organize themselves around shared needs. They create symbols to express belonging. They build systems to manage risk. They record agreements to preserve memory. The forms differ. The impulse endures. And that enduring impulse to structure life thoughtfully within the limits of its age is what truly defines the Middle Ages. Not darkness, not absurdity, but resilience, organization, and the steady work of building a world that could hold together. If we allow ourselves one final layer of reflection, we might notice that the medieval world forces us to reconsider what we mean by progress. Progress is often imagined as a clean upward line. More technology, more knowledge, more freedom. Yet the medieval centuries remind us that history is rarely so simple. It is built from overlapping systems, inherited traditions, gradual refinements, and occasional disruptions. The people of the Middle Ages did not experience themselves as living in an in-between era. They were not waiting for something called the Renaissance to validate them. They were solving the problems in front of them with the intellectual tools, spiritual frameworks, and material resources available. In doing so, they laid foundations that later periods would inherit, modify, and sometimes forget. Even something as seemingly decorative as Gothic architecture illustrates this point. The soaring arches and intricate stone tracery were not merely aesthetic experiments. They represented advances in engineering knowledge, an understanding of weight distribution, stress, and light. Builders did not possess modern mathematical models, but they learned through observation, trial, and shared craft knowledge. Over time, structures grew taller, windows larger, interiors brighter. That evolution was cumulative. The same gradual refinement appears in legal traditions. Medieval courts recorded precedents. Rulings influenced later judgments. Customary rights were codified. In England, the development of common law during the medieval period created a system based on case history. That approach to law, evolving through recorded decisions, remains influential today. Agricultural adaptation followed similar patterns. Innovations such as improved plow designs, crop rotation techniques, and water-powered mills did not transform society overnight. But over centuries, they increased productivity and supported urban growth. Those incremental changes altered demographics and economic possibilities. When modern audiences focus on the unusual or theatrical elements of medieval life, they risk overlooking the steady accumulation of knowledge. Pointed shoes and sumptuary laws capture attention. But behind them were improvements in metallurgy, textile production, bookkeeping, and urban administration. Another important theme is memory of crisis. The medieval world endured repeated shocks, plague, famine, warfare. Yet communities recorded these events, interpreted them, and adjusted practices accordingly. Public health measures, wage regulations, and charitable institutions evolved in response to lived experience. There was learning even without modern scientific frameworks. This capacity to absorb disruption without complete collapse is one of the period's most underappreciated traits. Institutions bent under pressure but often did not break. Guilds adapted membership rules. Towns negotiated new privileges. Religious practices shifted emphasis. The medieval world was resilient not because it avoided hardship, but because it embedded response mechanisms within its structures. In many ways, the medieval emphasis on visible order, ritual, hierarchy, symbol functioned as psychological stability. In uncertain times, clarity matters. Knowing your role, your obligations, and your place within a larger system can provide reassurance. While modern societies value flexibility and fluid identity, they also struggle with fragmentation and ambiguity. The medieval model offered solidity, even at the cost of rigidity. As we bring this long exploration to rest, the Middle Ages stand less as a catalogue of oddities and more as a reminder of human continuity. Across a millennium, people built cities, codified laws, cultivated land, trained apprentices, recorded agreements, celebrated festivals, and preserved memory. They did so without electricity, without rapid transport, without digital networks. Their trends, whether in fashion, governance, or ritual, were not random curiosities. They were expressions of deeper priorities: stability, identity, fairness, continuity, and meaning. And perhaps that is the quiet conclusion. When we strip away caricature and look patiently, the medieval world appears neither absurd nor primitive. It appears human, structured, adaptive, determined to endure. In that determination across centuries of change, it reflects something timeless: the effort to build systems that hold together long enough for the next generation to inherit them. That effort continues in every age, including our own. And so, as we let the medieval world settle into the background, what remains is not a list of strange habits, but a pattern of intention. The Middle Ages were long, nearly 1,000 years of shifting borders, rising towns, collapsing dynasties, new technologies, religious reform, demographic disaster, and gradual recovery. No single image can contain that span. Yet across those centuries, certain instincts repeat themselves. Organize what you can, preserve what matters, mark time together, and make meaning visible. Even medieval fear was structured. When plague returned, towns did not only pray, they experimented with isolation. When harvests failed, communities rationed, stored, and appealed for aid. When trade expanded, merchants developed contracts and partnerships to manage risk. Medieval responses were framed by belief, but they were rarely passive. It is also important to remember that the medieval period fostered creativity in conditions that were often harsh. Poetry, illuminated manuscripts, stained glass, music, and architecture were not luxuries detached from daily life. They were integrated into it. Cathedrals were places of worship, yes, but also civic landmarks, gathering spaces, and expressions of communal pride. Art was not confined to galleries. It lived in prayer books, tapestries, carvings, and city streets. This blending of beauty and function is another subtle medieval trend. Craftsmanship carried aesthetic weight even in practical objects. A well-forged tool, a carefully woven garment, a carved doorway, each reflected pride and skill. The line between utility and artistry was thin. Modern production often separates those realms. Function and beauty can be divided across industries. Medieval life intertwined them because specialization, while present, was rooted in smaller communities. The maker and the user were rarely far apart. There is also something deeply instructive about medieval patience. Buildings rose slowly. Knowledge circulated deliberately. News traveled at the speed of wind and hoof. That slower tempo did not eliminate urgency. Wars and famines demanded rapid response, but it did shape expectation. People understood that many outcomes unfolded over seasons or years. In that slower unfolding, continuity became a stabilizing force. Children inherited trades. Families passed down land. Religious observances linked generations. Memory bridged past and present in tangible ways. When modern observers encounter medieval trends that seem excessive, long ceremonial processions, rigid clothing codes, elaborate feast days, they may overlook the function those rituals served. Ritual creates shared reference points. It reinforces collective identity. It marks transitions. In uncertain times, ritual anchors experience. The Middle Ages were uncertain by any measure. Life expectancy was shorter. Medical knowledge was limited. Political authority could shift abruptly. Yet through visible structure, law, custom, symbol, craft, communities constructed resilience. Resilience did not mean equality or comfort. Medieval society contained deep inequalities and exclusions, but resilience meant persistence. Institutions endured long enough to adapt. Knowledge accumulated rather than vanishing. Towns rebuilt after fire. Trade resumed after war. If we remove the modern label of absurd, what we see instead is experimentation under constraint. Some experiments succeeded and became tradition. Others faded. But all of them were attempts to answer the same fundamental questions we ask today. How should we live together? How do we share resources? How do we signal belonging? How do we remember who we are? The answers differed in form. The tools were simpler, the symbols more overt, but the questions were constant. In the end, the medieval world is not best understood as a contrast to modernity, but as one of its foundations. Many of the structures we rely on, universities, legal precedents, financial contracts, urban governance, took recognizable shape in those centuries. So when we revisit medieval trends, whether practical or peculiar, we are not peering into an alien landscape. We are looking at an earlier draft of organized society, imperfect, evolving, sometimes theatrical, but deeply intentional. And that intention, sustained across a millennium, is what makes the Middle Ages not a curiosity, but a chapter of enduring relevance. If we allow ourselves one last slow pass through the medieval world, we begin to see that what truly defined it was not spectacle, nor superstition, nor stagnation, but structure under pressure. Medieval society existed in a delicate balance. Harvests could fail. Trade could be interrupted by war. Disease could spread without warning. In response, communities did not simply endure. They organized. They built redundancies into their systems. They relied on layered authority rather than singular control. They preserved records so that rights and obligations would not dissolve with memory. They created rituals that reaffirmed belonging when circumstances felt unstable. This instinct toward reinforcement explains much of what seems excessive to modern eyes. A guild did more than regulate trade. It ensured quality, mutual aid, and identity. A festival did more than entertain. It synchronized community around shared time. A charter did more than grant privilege. It formalized relationship between ruler and town. Even clothing laws, however restrictive, attempted to clarify social boundaries in periods of rapid economic change. Clarity in a world of limited communication and high risk was a form of security. Another defining trait was cumulative thinking. Medieval builders did not invent from nothing. They inherited Roman engineering principles, adapted local techniques, and refined designs through experience. Over generations, arches grew more ambitious, vaults more intricate, windows larger. Progress was layered, not abrupt. The same applied to scholarship. The scholastic method, careful questioning of authoritative texts, may seem constrained by tradition, yet it cultivated habits of structured argument. Students learned to analyze objections, consider counterpoints, and refine conclusions. That intellectual discipline shaped later developments in philosophy, law, and theology. In agriculture, rotation systems improved soil sustainability. In trade, accounting practices evolved to manage increasing complexity. In governance, councils and assemblies negotiated local concerns. None of these shifts occurred overnight, but over centuries they reshaped Europe's social landscape. Perhaps what feels most foreign today is the medieval acceptance of visible hierarchy. Rank was not subtle. It was displayed in clothing, architecture, and ceremony. Modern societies often claim greater fluidity, yet hierarchy persists in different forms. The medieval world simply made it unmistakable. Visibility had consequences. It reinforced order, but it also limited mobility. It clarified responsibility, but it restricted aspiration. Like all systems, it carried trade-offs. And trade-offs are central to understanding the medieval mindset. Stability often required rigidity. Continuity required adherence to precedent. Collective identity sometimes overshadowed individual freedom. Yet within those boundaries, people found ways to innovate, negotiate, and adapt. The Middle Ages were not static. They witnessed urban growth, intellectual revival, commercial expansion, demographic collapse, and gradual recovery. They produced both conflict and creativity. They fostered institutions that survived long after their founders were gone. When we speak of absurd medieval trends, we are often isolating surface details without tracing the framework beneath them. But once that framework becomes visible, the details align with purpose. The pointed shoe signaled leisure and rank. The guild regulated fragile markets. The public clock unified urban schedules. The manuscript preserved continuity. The festival reinforced cohesion. The charter stabilized governance. Each element in isolation may seem strange. Together, they form a coherent attempt to manage life within constraint. And that, perhaps, is the enduring message. The medieval period was not waiting for enlightenment. It was constructing systems strong enough to carry communities forward through uncertainty. We may not wish to revive its hierarchies or limitations, but we can recognize the discipline of its organization, the patience of its craftsmanship, and the resilience of its institutions. Across 1,000 years, medieval societies did what every society must do. They built structures to survive their own fragility. And in that steady, deliberate effort, the so-called absurd fades away, revealing instead a long, complex chapter of thoughtful human adaptation. As we truly bring this exploration to its final moments, it's helpful to remember that history is rarely about isolated details. It is about systems interacting over time. The Middle Ages were not defined by one fashion trend, one legal code, or one architectural style. They were defined by continuity across change. For nearly a millennium, medieval societies navigated cycles of expansion and contraction. Towns grew around trade routes. Plague reduced populations dramatically. Recovery followed, sometimes slowly, sometimes unevenly. Through it all, institutions persisted. That persistence deserves attention. Take the parish church, for example. In many communities, it was the most consistent structure in daily life. Generations were baptized, married, and buried within the same walls. Announcements were made there. Records were kept there. Charity was organized there. Even when political leadership shifted, the parish remained. It anchored memory. Similarly, the marketplace functioned as both economic and social center. It was where goods changed hands, but also where news spread and disputes were aired. Markets operated according to predictable schedules, reinforcing stability in food supply and pricing. Inspections of weights and measures may seem overly meticulous to modern viewers, but they addressed a simple truth: trust sustains trade. In governance, medieval councils and assemblies created channels for participation, however limited by status. Urban communes negotiated rights with monarchs. Nobles formed advisory bodies. Legal petitions were recorded and reviewed. These were not democratic institutions in the modern sense, but they were not voiceless systems either. Negotiation was built into the framework. The medieval worldview was deeply shaped by faith, and that faith influenced everything from law to agriculture. Yet belief did not eliminate practical reasoning. Farmers observed soil patterns. Builders calculated weight distribution through experience. Merchants balanced risk against reward. Religious explanation and pragmatic adaptation coexisted rather than excluding one another. One of the most important trends across the medieval centuries was institutional layering. When new practices emerged, they were added to existing structures rather than replacing them outright. Roman legal traditions persisted in parts of Europe. Local customs continued alongside royal decrees. Monastic scholarship informed emerging universities. This layering created resilience. If one element faltered, others remained. It is also worth acknowledging the role of memory in shaping identity. Medieval chronicles recorded not only triumphs, but disasters. Plague outbreaks, famines, wars, these events were documented and interpreted. Communities understood themselves in relation to shared experience. Memory reinforced continuity even through rupture. When modern audiences encounter medieval fashion excesses or strict social codes, it can be tempting to reduce the era to caricature. But caricature flattens complexity. The Middle Ages contained innovation, conflict, creativity, and negotiation. They witnessed the development of banking practices, the spread of literacy, the codification of law, and the expansion of trade networks. The so-called absurd trends were often surface expressions of deeper systems. Clothing laws reflected anxiety about economic mobility. Festivals reinforced communal solidarity. Public rituals clarified hierarchy and responsibility. Even exaggerated footwear signaled participation in social language. If there is a single thread connecting all of this, it is intentionality. Medieval people did not drift through their world without structure. They built frameworks, sometimes rigid, sometimes flexible, that allowed communities to function across generations. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson that lingers. Every era develops practices shaped by its limits. Some practices will later seem strange. Others will endure. What matters is the effort to organize life meaningfully within constraint. The Middle Ages did exactly that. Across centuries of challenge, communities constructed systems to manage trade, preserve knowledge, regulate behavior, and sustain belief. They were not perfect systems, but they were durable. When we look carefully, beyond the theatrical details, the medieval world appears not absurd, but deliberate, an extended experiment in maintaining order through visible structure and shared obligation. And in that deliberate effort, stretching across 1,000 years, we find something both distant and familiar: the human determination to build a world sturdy enough to last. If we step back one final time and look at the medieval centuries as a whole, what becomes most striking is their longevity. 1,000 years is not a brief experiment. It is an extended stretch of human organization that endured through environmental shifts, political upheavals, demographic collapse, and intellectual transformation. Whatever its limitations, medieval society was not fragile in the way it is sometimes portrayed. It was adaptive enough to survive. Adaptation often came through refinement rather than reinvention. When trade expanded, bookkeeping improved. When cities grew, municipal offices multiplied. When labor shortages emerged after plague, laws were adjusted, sometimes clumsily, sometimes effectively. Systems were rarely abandoned outright. They were modified. Even language evolved gradually. Latin remained the language of scholarship and administration for much of the period, but vernacular languages gained written form over time. Legal documents, poetry, and devotional texts increasingly appeared in local tongues. This linguistic shift broadened participation in written culture. It was not a sudden revolution, but a slow widening of access. That gradual widening can also be seen in education. Cathedral schools gave way to universities. Universities standardized curricula and degrees. Over time, literacy expanded beyond clerical circles into merchant and urban classes. Written contracts became more common. Communication networks strengthened. The medieval world, then, was not closed or immobile. It was layered and evolving. The trends that catch our attention, whether dramatic fashion or elaborate ceremony, existed alongside quieter transformations in commerce, scholarship, and governance. It is also important to note that medieval Europe was never isolated from the wider world. Trade connected it to North Africa, the Byzantine Empire, and parts of Asia. Ideas traveled alongside goods. Mathematical knowledge, medical texts, and philosophical works circulated across cultural boundaries. The medieval period was shaped by exchange as much as by internal development. This interconnectedness complicates the image of a self-contained, insular age. It reveals a society engaged with broader networks, adapting imported knowledge to local frameworks. When we revisit the so-called absurd trends with this broader view, they appear less like signs of backwardness and more like expressions of a complex social vocabulary. Symbols mattered because communication needed clarity. Ritual mattered because cohesion required reinforcement. Regulation mattered because markets depended on trust. The Middle Ages remind us that structure is not the enemy of creativity. Within established frameworks, artisans experimented with form. Scholars debated subtle distinctions. Merchants negotiated innovative contracts. Farmers adjusted techniques to shifting climates. Innovation occurred within continuity. Perhaps what feels most distant today is the acceptance of visible limits. Medieval people lived with constraints that could not be engineered away quickly. Rather than imagining total control over environment or economy, they built systems that acknowledged vulnerability. Crop rotation assumed soil exhaustion. Storehouses anticipated scarcity. Religious calendars structured hope around uncertainty. In that acknowledgement of vulnerability lies a quiet realism. Stability was never guaranteed. It had to be maintained through collective effort. As we conclude this extended reflection, the phrase "absurd medieval trends" feels less adequate than it did at the beginning. The Middle Ages were not defined by oddities, but by organization. They were centuries of negotiation between belief and practicality, hierarchy and cooperation, memory and adaptation. Some practices deserve to remain in the past. Others offer perspective on durability, community, and patience. All of them belong to a long narrative of human beings shaping systems strong enough to endure their own fragility. And that endurance, measured not in decades but in centuries, is the quiet achievement of the medieval world. As we let the final echoes of the medieval world settle, what ultimately emerges is proportion. The Middle Ages were not a footnote wedged between more celebrated eras. They were a vast stretch of time in which millions of people lived ordinary, structured lives, farming, trading, teaching, building, praying, arguing, negotiating, and adapting. It is easy to focus on what they lacked, but absence alone does not define a civilization. Medieval Europe lacked modern medicine, yet it built hospitals. It lacked electricity, yet it engineered cathedrals that manipulated light with astonishing precision. It lacked instant communication, yet it sustained trade networks and diplomatic relationships across long distances. Perhaps the most overlooked feature of the period is continuity of everyday routine. The farmer rising with daylight, the baker preparing ovens before market hours, the apprentice practicing a trade under supervision, the bell marking the passage of time. These habits repeated across generations. Stability came not from grand gestures alone, but from repetition. Repetition in medieval life created resilience. Agricultural cycles returned each year. Feast days punctuated seasons predictably. Guild meetings followed established rules. Even in times of upheaval, familiar rhythms continued where possible. Those rhythms grounded communities. We might also consider how medieval people understood legacy. Many of the structures they built, churches, bridges, defensive walls, were intended to outlast their creators. Inscriptions recorded names not for fleeting recognition, but for enduring remembrance. Foundations were laid with the assumption that completion might belong to the next generation. This orientation toward the future contrasts with modern expectations of immediacy. Medieval builders accepted that fulfillment might be delayed. Their investment was measured in centuries. It is equally important to acknowledge that medieval society was not monolithic. Experiences differed dramatically depending on region, status, gender, and occupation. A merchant in a thriving port city lived differently from a peasant in a remote village. A scholar at a university inhabited a different intellectual world from a rural laborer. Yet across these differences, shared structures, religious observance, market systems, legal customs, linked communities. Even conflict, when it arose, often unfolded within known frameworks. Revolts articulated grievances in familiar legal language. Disputes were brought before courts. Alliances were formalized through oaths. This reliance on structured negotiation reinforced continuity, even amid tension. When modern viewers encounter medieval fashion extravagance or strict social codes, it can feel theatrical. But theater itself served purpose. Public display clarified roles. Ceremony reinforced agreement. Symbolism conveyed identity quickly in largely oral societies. If we remove the label of absurdity and replace it with curiosity, the medieval world becomes more comprehensible. Practices that once seemed irrational align with broader goals. Preserving order, reinforcing trust, sustaining belief, and managing limited resources. And perhaps the final insight is this: every era normalizes its own habits. Medieval society normalized hierarchy, visible ritual, and slow communication because those conditions fit its environment. Our own era normalizes digital mediation, rapid consumption, and abstract systems because they fit ours. Centuries from now, historians may look back at our trends with similar distance. They may question our fashions, our information cycles, our architectural choices. Context will shape their understanding, just as it shapes ours today. The Middle Ages, when studied patiently, reveal not darkness, but depth. They show a civilization organizing itself carefully within constraint. They show communities capable of endurance, adaptation, and collective effort. And in that long effort, stretching across a millennium, we find something steady and familiar: the human instinct to build systems strong enough to carry life forward. That instinct remains unchanged. As we draw this long exploration fully to a close, the medieval world stands not as a curiosity cabinet of strange fashions and rigid customs, but as a sustained exercise in continuity. For nearly 1,000 years, communities across Europe woke each morning to tasks that demanded cooperation. Fields had to be worked in season, tools repaired, accounts balanced, walls maintained, children instructed, disputes resolved. None of this required spectacle. It required reliability. Reliability was the quiet backbone of medieval life. Market days were predictable. Feast days returned annually. Apprenticeships followed known stages. Legal processes, however imperfect, adhered to recognizable forms. Even authority, though layered and unequal, was structured through oath and obligation rather than pure unpredictability. In a world where natural forces could not be controlled, where harvests depended on weather and disease could strike without warning, social stability mattered deeply. Ritual, hierarchy, and regulation were not random impositions. They were mechanisms to reduce uncertainty where possible. The pointed shoes and strict clothing laws, so often highlighted as absurd, were surface expressions of this deeper instinct. Clothing communicated status clearly in a society where rank shaped responsibility. Regulation attempted to manage rapid economic shifts. Public ceremony reinforced agreements that might otherwise dissolve. But beneath these visible elements were quieter achievements. Universities standardized learning across regions. Legal traditions refined principles of precedent. Urban councils experimented with civic governance. Merchants developed accounting practices that allowed trade to scale beyond face-to-face exchange. Agricultural systems evolved to protect soil fertility. Watermills and windmills harnessed renewable energy sources efficiently. Craft traditions preserved technical skill through careful mentorship. These were not trivial accomplishments. They sustained populations through centuries of change. It is also worth remembering that medieval society contained imagination alongside structure. Literature flourished in multiple languages. Music filled churches and courts. Artistic expression transformed stone and glass into narratives of belief and identity. Creativity was not stifled by order. It operated within it. When crises arrived, and they did repeatedly, communities responded using existing frameworks. Plague prompted quarantine measures. Labor shortages led to negotiation and regulation. War reshaped political alliances but did not erase administrative memory. Systems flexed. Flexibility within structure may be the most accurate description of the medieval achievement. The era was not static, but it was anchored. Innovation did not require abandoning tradition entirely. It often grew from it. If we compare that to our own time, we might recognize a familiar tension. We value speed and disruption. The medieval world valued durability and continuity. Neither approach is inherently superior. Each reflects its environment. What the Middle Ages ultimately demonstrate is that complexity does not depend solely on technology. It depends on coordination, memory, and shared norms. Medieval societies possessed all three. They organized life through visible signals and documented agreements. They preserved knowledge in manuscripts and institutions. They sustained trade and scholarship across generations. When viewed from a distance, some practices seem unusual. But context dissolves much of that strangeness. Every custom answered a question posed by its time. And so, as we step away, the medieval period feels less like an era of absurd trends and more like a long, disciplined attempt to create stability within constraint. People were not naive. They were attentive to seasons, to status, to obligation, to memory. Across a millennium, they built systems sturdy enough to endure wars, famines, plagues, and reformations. That endurance is not accidental. It is the product of deliberate structure. In the end, what remains is not spectacle, but steadiness. Not caricature, but coherence. The Middle Ages were a testament to the human capacity to organize life thoughtfully, even when tools were limited and uncertainty constant. And in that steadiness, across centuries of challenge, we find something enduringly recognizable: the quiet determination to make a fragile world hold together. If we let the camera pull back one last time, rising slowly above medieval towns and fields, what comes into focus is not chaos, but pattern. Stone churches anchoring villages, market squares set at crossroads, fields divided into strips worked in rotation, monasteries positioned along rivers, town walls tracing careful boundaries. None of this was accidental. Medieval landscapes were organized with intention, shaped by inherited knowledge and adjusted through experience. For all the dramatic events that fill history books, battles, coronations, revolts, the medieval world was sustained by quieter forces. Routine, obligation, shared belief, and accumulated skill. Generations repeated the same tasks with incremental improvement. Plow blade redesigned slightly, a bridge reinforced, a legal clause clarified. Over time, those refinements compounded. It is easy to overlook incremental change because it lacks spectacle. But medieval progress was often incremental. Universities did not appear overnight as centers of intellectual influence. They evolved from cathedral schools. Banking systems did not spring fully formed. They developed through merchant experimentation. Urban governance matured gradually as towns negotiated charters and privileges. The patience embedded in this process is striking. Builders laid foundations knowing they might never see completion. Scholars wrote commentaries expecting future scholars to respond. Craftsmen trained apprentices who would surpass them. Medieval society assumed continuity. Continuity, however, did not mean stagnation. The introduction of mechanical clocks altered urban life. The spread of paper gradually reduced reliance on parchment. The expansion of trade reshaped diets and consumption patterns. Even fashion trends, sometimes exaggerated, reflected shifting wealth and aspiration. If we examine those fashions more closely, they reveal not foolishness, but communication. Clothing conveyed occupation, status, region, and allegiance. In societies without mass media, visual language mattered. The medieval world was highly literate in symbols, even when many individuals were not literate in text. Symbols extended beyond clothing into heraldry, architecture, and ceremony. A coat of arms signaled lineage. A cathedral facade told biblical stories in stone. A procession communicated civic unity. These were systems of shared meaning, accessible across education levels. When modern observers describe medieval customs as absurd, they often isolate the visible symbol without acknowledging the invisible structure supporting it. But the symbol was rarely isolated. It belonged to a network of law, economy, and belief. Another defining element was resilience through redundancy. Authority was layered: king, noble, bishop, council. Economy was diversified: agriculture, craft, trade. Knowledge was preserved in multiple centers: monasteries, courts, urban schools. If one node faltered, others could compensate. This redundancy did not eliminate suffering. Famine and plague were devastating, but institutions endured beyond individual crises. That endurance is evidence of structural strength. The medieval mindset also embraced limitation. Nature imposed boundaries. Technology constrained speed. Information traveled slowly. Rather than imagining unlimited expansion, medieval societies often sought equilibrium, balancing land use, regulating markets, structuring time. In contrast, modern culture often assumes continuous acceleration. The medieval period reminds us that durability sometimes depends on pacing and restraint. As we close this extended reflection, the phrase "absurd medieval trends" feels almost ironic. What seemed absurd at first glance becomes comprehensible within context. What looked theatrical reveals deeper logic. What felt distant becomes familiar. The Middle Ages were not a detour from progress. They were a sustained era of adaptation, negotiation, and cumulative learning. Their people lived within tighter constraints, yet built systems that endured for centuries. And perhaps that is the final perspective worth carrying forward, that human societies, regardless of era, are defined less by their eccentricities and more by their efforts to create order. The medieval world did exactly that, patiently, visibly, and with a determination that allowed it to last. In the end, beyond the pointed shoes and strict codes, beyond the processions and proclamations, lies a simple truth. Across 1,000 years, people organized their world carefully enough for it to hold. And that quiet achievement is anything but absurd. As the final light fades on the medieval world, what lingers is not the spectacle of its most unusual customs, but the endurance of its foundations. Across fields divided into careful strips, across stone bridges spanning slow rivers, across cathedral towns whose bells marked the hours, medieval society repeated a central act. It organized itself. Not perfectly, not equally, but persistently. The pointed shoes, the sumptuary laws, the grand processions. These were visible expressions of a culture deeply concerned with clarity. Who belongs where? Who owes what? Who leads and who follows? In a world without instant communication or centralized databases, clarity had to be displayed. It had to be seen and heard. Markets displayed fairness through inspected weights. Guild halls displayed professional identity. Heraldic shields displayed lineage. Even the ringing of bells displayed the passage of time. Medieval life unfolded in public. That public nature shaped behavior. Reputation mattered because it was visible. Obligation mattered because it was witnessed. Authority mattered because it was embodied in stone and ceremony. While modern systems often operate quietly in the background, medieval systems were meant to be recognized. And yet, beneath that visibility lay subtlety. Contracts were negotiated carefully. Charters were drafted with precise language. Agricultural systems balanced soil recovery with crop demand. Builders refined engineering techniques across generations. Intellectual debates unfolded in structured disputations that demanded careful reasoning. The Middle Ages were neither irrational nor unthinking. They were deliberate within their limits. Limits defined much of medieval experience. Energy was scarce. Transport was slow. Illness was poorly understood. But those limits did not prevent sophistication. They encouraged systems built around sustainability and predictability. Crop rotation preserved fertility. Apprenticeships preserved skill. Monastic scriptoria preserved texts. Local courts preserved custom. Continuity was a survival strategy. Perhaps what feels most distant today is the medieval comfort with hierarchy. Rank structured society from monarchy to peasantry. That structure could be restrictive and unjust. Yet it also clarified responsibility. Nobles owed protection. Peasants owed labor. Guild masters owed training. Roles were defined even if unequal. Modern societies emphasize mobility and fluidity, but they too depend on structure, often less visible but no less real. The medieval world simply displayed its scaffolding openly. It is tempting to evaluate the past through the lens of what came after. But the Middle Ages deserve to be understood on their own terms. They were a millennium of human adaptation, marked by gradual refinement rather than constant revolution. By the time the medieval period gave way to what historians call the early modern era, Europe had inherited universities, legal traditions, financial instruments, municipal governments, and architectural achievements forged across centuries. These were not accidents. They were cumulative outcomes of sustained effort. When we began with the idea of absurd medieval trends, the phrase invited a smile, but after careful examination, the smile softens into recognition. The trends were rarely absurd in context. They were meaningful signals within a structured world. And that world, though distant, was not alien. People sought stability, fairness, belonging, and legacy, just as we do. They organized their societies carefully within the knowledge and resources available to them. In the end, the Middle Ages remind us that every era builds systems it believes will endure. Some of those systems last, others fade, but the impulse to create order remains constant. Across 1,000 years of change, medieval communities built a world sturdy enough to carry them forward. That quiet resilience, not the pointed shoe, not the elaborate feast, is the true legacy of the age. If we sit with the medieval world just a little longer, something subtle begins to surface. It is not only that medieval societies were structured, it is that they were deeply aware of fragility. Harvests could fail, timber could rot, stone could crack, alliances could collapse, illness could sweep through a town in weeks. In that environment, permanence was never assumed. It had to be built literally and socially. This awareness shaped medieval architecture in profound ways. Builders over-engineered where they could. Walls were thick, foundations deep, buttresses reinforced weight. Bridges were anchored carefully. Even modest parish churches were constructed with attention to durability. These were not disposable buildings. They were intended to endure weather, war, and time. The same principle extended beyond stone. Legal systems were designed to remember. Written charters safeguarded rights across generations. Seals authenticated agreements. Records were copied to preserve them. Memory was not left to chance. That insistence on preservation reflects a broader medieval instinct: survival through continuity. If something worked, an agricultural method, a craft technique, a legal precedent, it was retained and transmitted. Innovation happened, but it was often grafted onto existing frameworks rather than replacing them entirely. This approach could appear conservative, yet it provided stability. Rapid disruption was rare. Gradual adaptation was preferred. Even in matters of belief, medieval society demonstrated layered complexity. Religious life was not only institutional, it was personal and local. Pilgrimages created networks of movement and exchange. Parish life structured community identity. Monastic orders experimented with discipline and scholarship. The spiritual and practical were not separated into distinct spheres. They overlapped constantly. To modern observers, this blending may seem all-encompassing. But for medieval people, it provided coherence. Faith offered explanation, ritual offered rhythm, and community offered support. The so-called absurd trends, whether exaggerated fashion or rigid codes, fit into this larger pursuit of coherence. In a hierarchical society, visual signals prevented confusion. In a market-dependent town, regulation prevented mistrust. In a world of limited literacy, public ceremony communicated shared values clearly. Clarity was a form of security. It is also worth reflecting on medieval patience with imperfection. Crop yields varied. Roads deteriorated. Political disputes simmered. Solutions were rarely immediate. Instead, communities relied on endurance season after season, year after year. That endurance was supported by interdependence. No household was entirely isolated. Craft, trade, agriculture, and governance required cooperation. Obligations bound individuals to one another in visible ways. The system was unequal, but it was interconnected. Interconnection created accountability. If a craftsman produced poor work, reputation suffered. If a merchant cheated scales, trust dissolved. Medieval life operated at a scale where actions had tangible social consequences. As we conclude this final reflection, the medieval world feels less like a distant stage of eccentric customs and more like a prolonged exercise in balance between change and continuity, hierarchy and cooperation, scarcity and creativity. Across centuries, medieval communities refined tools, preserved knowledge, negotiated authority, and marked time together. They built institutions that outlived them. They recorded agreements so memory would not fade. They structured society visibly so expectations would remain clear. What remains most striking is not the peculiarity of certain fashions or rituals, but the steadiness of effort. The Middle Ages endured because they organized themselves deliberately within the limits of their world. And perhaps that is the enduring takeaway. Beneath the surface details that capture attention lies a civilization committed to making fragile conditions manageable. Not absurdity, but adaptation. Not darkness, but durability. Across 1,000 years, the medieval world held together, not by accident, but by design. As we settle into the very last stretch of this journey, the medieval world begins to feel less like a distant curiosity and more like a long experiment in sustainability. Sustainability, in its simplest sense, means creating systems that can endure stress. Medieval societies had no choice but to think in these terms. Agricultural land could be exhausted if mismanaged. Forests could be depleted. Trade could falter if trust eroded. Authority could fragment if loyalty dissolved. The survival of communities depended on managing these risks carefully. This is why so many medieval practices were regulatory. Forest laws controlled access to timber and game. Guild rules governed the quality and quantity of production. Market inspections protected fairness. Even church calendars structured periods of consumption and restraint. These were not arbitrary constraints. They were guardrails designed to preserve equilibrium. Equilibrium did not mean equality. Medieval societies were stratified and often harsh. Yet the underlying logic of balance between land use and renewal, between authority and obligation, between wealth and display was persistent. Consider medieval town planning. Streets were often narrow, buildings close together, and public squares central. This density encouraged interaction and oversight. Trade was visible. Disputes were public. News traveled by voice and bell. Urban life was compact and communal. In rural settings, open field systems distributed strips of land among families, intertwining their fortunes. Cooperation was not optional. It was necessary. Shared plowing schedules and harvest coordination reflected mutual dependence. Even in warfare, sustainability played a role. Castles were placed strategically to control territory and protect trade routes. Siege warfare emphasized patience and supply management rather than constant direct assault. Logistics mattered as much as bravery. When viewed through this lens, many medieval trends appear less eccentric and more functional. Sumptuary laws, though restrictive, attempted to manage social tension caused by visible wealth shifts. Public ceremonies reinforced loyalty in fragmented political landscapes. Apprenticeships ensured that technical knowledge did not vanish with one generation. The medieval world invested heavily in continuity because it understood how easily disruption could unravel fragile systems. It is also worth recognizing that medieval Europe was part of a broader interconnected world. Trade and intellectual exchange linked it to Islamic civilizations, the Byzantine Empire, and parts of Asia. Scientific, medical, and philosophical texts moved across cultural boundaries. These exchanges enriched local systems and introduced new techniques. Far from being isolated, the medieval period participated in a dynamic web of interaction. Ideas were translated, adapted, and incorporated into existing frameworks. As we conclude this extended reflection, one truth stands out. The Middle Ages were not an age of improvisation without structure. They were an age of careful construction, social, legal, architectural, and intellectual. Some customs now feel distant. Some hierarchies were deeply unjust. But within their context, medieval practices served purposes that supported survival and identity. If we look beyond surface oddities, we see a civilization deeply invested in durability. It built thick walls and detailed records. It trained successors patiently. It marked time publicly. It embedded meaning in stone and ritual. The phrase "absurd medieval trends" captures attention. But after careful study, what remains is not absurdity. It is design. Design shaped by scarcity. Design shaped by belief. Design shaped by the persistent human need to make a complex world manageable. Across 1,000 years, the medieval world endured, not because it was primitive, but because it was structured. And in that structure lies its true legacy. As we take this final, unhurried step away from the medieval world, what ultimately becomes clear is that it was not an era defined by spectacle, but by scaffolding. Scaffolding is rarely admired once a building is complete. It exists to support, to stabilize, to hold weight in place while something larger rises. Medieval society functioned much the same way. Its visible customs, ceremonies, dress codes, guild rules, charters, processions, were the scaffolding that allowed communities to endure across centuries of uncertainty. The 1,000-year span we call the Middle Ages was not uniform. It contained moments of expansion and contraction, optimism and despair. Populations grew in the High Middle Ages as agriculture improved and towns flourished. Then came the Black Death, reducing entire regions by staggering proportions. Yet even in that devastation, structures remained. Markets reopened. Fields were replanted. Institutions adjusted to new labor realities. That adjustment reveals something fundamental. Medieval systems were not brittle. They were designed, often unconsciously, with redundancy. Authority was layered. Economy was diversified between agriculture, craft, and trade. Knowledge was stored in multiple monasteries, courts, and urban centers. If one element faltered, others carried forward. The medieval relationship with time also deserves a final reflection. Time was not merely measured, it was ritualized. Bells marked hours for prayer and work. Liturgical calendars structured seasons. Agricultural cycles reinforced repetition. This ritualization of time created continuity. Even when political leadership shifted or disaster struck, the calendar turned predictably. Predictability is a powerful stabilizer. In a world where nature could not be controlled, human-made rhythms offered reassurance. When we think of medieval trends that appear exaggerated, ornate clothing, strict hierarchies, elaborate public festivals, it is important to see them as communication tools. In largely oral societies, clarity had to be visible. Status, allegiance, authority, and belonging were displayed through material culture and shared ritual. These signals reduced ambiguity. Ambiguity in times of fragility can be destabilizing. The medieval world often chose visibility over subtlety. It is also worth noting how seriously medieval people treated permanence. Buildings were constructed to last. Manuscripts were copied carefully to preserve texts. Seals authenticated documents across generations. Even burial sites were chosen with long memory in mind. There was a profound awareness that what was built today might speak for centuries. That long view influenced decision-making. Investments were made not only for immediate gain but for communal legacy. Cathedrals begun in one century were completed in another. Bridges were funded collectively. Universities trained scholars who would shape future generations. None of this erases the inequalities embedded in medieval society. Many voices were marginalized. Power was unevenly distributed. Yet even within those constraints, negotiation existed. Towns petitioned for rights. Guilds asserted standards. Scholars debated authority. The system was hierarchical, but it was not inert. If modern culture values acceleration, the medieval world valued endurance. It assumed that stability came from repetition, from adherence to precedent, from visible obligation. Innovation was absorbed gradually into established frameworks rather than erupting in disruptive waves. And perhaps that is the final, quiet lesson. The Middle Ages were not absurd. They were deliberate. Their customs may seem theatrical to us, but they served structural purposes. Their hierarchies may feel rigid, but they clarified responsibility. Their rituals may appear excessive, but they reinforced belonging. Across a millennium, medieval societies constructed networks of trust, memory, and obligation strong enough to withstand repeated shock. They did so without modern machinery, without rapid communication, without centralized bureaucracies as we know them. What they relied on instead was continuity, carefully maintained through law, craft, architecture, and shared belief. When we strip away caricature and examine the framework beneath the surface details, we find coherence. We find a civilization committed to making life legible and durable in a world that was often neither. And in that commitment, steady, patient, visible, we see something deeply human. Not an age of darkness, not an age of absurdity, but an age of structure. An age that held together long enough to become the foundation upon which later centuries would build. That is the true legacy of the medieval world. As we truly bring this long reflection to its resting point, the medieval world resolves into something quieter than legend and more substantial than stereotype. It becomes a study in maintenance. Maintenance is rarely celebrated. It does not produce the drama of invention or the excitement of revolution. Yet maintenance is what keeps societies functioning once they are built. And for nearly 1,000 years, medieval communities practiced it constantly. Fields were maintained through rotation and shared labor. Roads were repaired by obligation. Town walls were inspected and reinforced. Market standards were checked again and again. Records were recopied to prevent loss. Apprentices were trained carefully so that skill would not vanish with a single lifetime. This culture of maintenance created continuity. Continuity, in turn, produced stability. It is easy to focus on moments of rupture, the Norman Conquest, the Crusades, the Black Death. But between those dramatic events stretched long periods of routine. It was during those routines that systems matured. Urban councils refined governance. Legal traditions accumulated precedent. Trade routes strengthened through repeated use. Religious institutions standardized liturgy and practice. Even medieval fashion, often cited as evidence of eccentricity, reveals continuity beneath change. Styles shifted, yes. Sleeves widened, hemlines rose or fell, shoes lengthened or shortened. But clothing remained a language. It communicated rank, wealth, occupation, and affiliation consistently. The grammar of that language endured even as vocabulary evolved. The same is true of law. While rulers changed and territories shifted, the concept of documented right persisted. Charters were preserved, agreements sealed, courts convened regularly. Justice was imperfect, but procedure mattered. Process itself was stabilizing. Another essential element was shared space. Medieval life unfolded in communal settings. Market squares, parish churches, guild halls, fields worked collectively. These spaces reinforced social bonds. They made authority visible and accountability tangible. Disputes were not hidden behind distant bureaucracy. They were negotiated among known participants. That proximity had advantages and limitations. It strengthened communal identity but could also intensify exclusion. Still, it ensured that systems were grounded in lived experience rather than abstraction. We should also acknowledge the medieval understanding of limitation. Nature imposed boundaries that could not be engineered away. Seasons governed work. Scarcity shaped consumption. Energy sources were finite and renewable: wind, water, wood, muscle. Rather than imagining limitless expansion, medieval societies aimed for balance within constraint. Balance is not a dramatic ideal, but it is durable. Over centuries, that durability produced remarkable outcomes. Universities institutionalized scholarship. Banking practices enabled long-distance commerce. Architectural techniques advanced steadily. Even early forms of representative assemblies emerged in certain regions. These developments did not arise from chaos. They emerged from societies committed to structure. And perhaps that is the final perspective worth holding. The Middle Ages were not defined by absurdity. They were defined by persistence, by repetition, by layered memory, by visible obligation, by incremental improvement rather than abrupt transformation. They were centuries of people waking each day to tasks that sustained their communities. They were centuries of agreements written carefully, buildings constructed patiently, and knowledge passed deliberately from teacher to student. If we look beyond the surface details that capture attention, we see a civilization deeply invested in holding itself together. That is not glamorous. It is not always just, but it is enduring. And endurance, across 1,000 years of change, is no small achievement. The medieval world held, and in that holding, in that steady maintenance of structure, we find its true significance. If we allow ourselves one final, steady breath within the medieval world, what ultimately comes into view is not a catalog of strange customs, but a civilization deeply invested in continuity across uncertainty. The Middle Ages were lived forward, not backward. People did not see themselves as occupying a middle between greatness and rebirth. They were inheritors of Rome, interpreters of faith, cultivators of land, builders of towns. They inherited systems and modified them carefully generation after generation. That act of inheritance, receiving, maintaining, adjusting, defined much of medieval life. Consider how carefully medieval societies treated obligation. Feudal bonds, while often rigid and unequal, were formalized through ceremony and oath. Guild membership required commitment and adherence to standards. Even marriage contracts detailed property arrangements and expectations. These were not casual associations. They were binding structures designed to reduce ambiguity in relationships that carried economic and social consequence. Ambiguity is destabilizing in fragile systems. The medieval world sought clarity. Clarity also shaped architecture. The skyline of a medieval town was intentional. The church tower or cathedral spire marked spiritual centrality. The castle or fortified manor signaled protection and authority. The market square provided civic focus. Space itself communicated order. And within those spaces, repetition created rhythm. Weekly markets, annual fairs, seasonal harvests, liturgical observances, apprenticeship milestones, court sessions. Life unfolded through cycles rather than constant novelty. Cycles, unlike trends, endure. They create expectation. They offer reassurance that disruption is temporary because pattern will return. Even when the Black Death shattered populations, cycles resumed. Land was reallocated. Labor renegotiated. Institutions adjusted. The shock was immense, but structure did not dissolve entirely. That capacity to reform around reduced numbers reveals strength embedded within the system. It is also important to see the medieval period as cumulative rather than static. Technical knowledge in architecture advanced through trial and correction. Vaulting techniques improved incrementally. Agricultural tools became more efficient. Accounting methods grew more precise as commerce expanded. The emergence of mechanical clocks in town centers altered daily coordination. Paper gradually supplemented parchment, making documentation more accessible. Literacy widened beyond exclusively clerical circles. These were not dramatic revolutions in a single year. They were gradual transitions layered onto existing frameworks. When modern audiences fixate on sumptuary laws or exaggerated fashion, they are often responding to surface expressions of deeper anxieties, economic mobility, social tension, visible wealth. Medieval societies responded to those anxieties with regulation and symbolism. We may choose different responses today, but the underlying tension remains familiar. In truth, Every era produces practices that later generations find peculiar. Medieval pointed shoes might seem impractical to us, but future observers may look at our own consumption patterns or digital rituals with equal bewilderment. Context shapes judgment. The enduring feature of the medieval world is not its eccentricities. It is its scaffolding legal memory, institutional continuity, communal rhythm, layered authority. These elements allowed communities to persist despite limitations in technology and vulnerability to natural forces. The medieval mindset accepted that human control over environment was partial. Therefore, systems had to compensate. Markets required inspection. Land required rotation. Authority required oath. Knowledge required copying. Identity required ritual reinforcement. None of this guaranteed justice or equality. The medieval world contained profound inequalities, but it demonstrates that complex societies can operate with coherence even under constraint. As we close this extended narrative, what remains is respect for durability. Across centuries often mischaracterized as dark or stagnant, people organized, negotiated, and built with remarkable persistence. The Middle Ages were not waiting for modernity to arrive. They were busy sustaining themselves, and that sustained effort, steady, structured, interdependent, is perhaps the least absurd thing imaginable. It is the work every civilization must undertake. And for 1,000 years, the medieval world did exactly that. As we rest at the very end of this long exploration, what ultimately distinguishes the medieval world is not how different it was from ours, but how seriously it treated the problem of survival over time. Survival was never assumed. It had to be organized. In medieval Europe, organization began at the smallest levels. A household was not merely a private dwelling. It was an economic unit, produced, stored, repaired, negotiated, and trained. Children learned trades within the rhythm of family life. Skills were not outsourced to distant systems. They were embedded in daily routine. Knowledge moved from hand to hand. Beyond the household stood the village or town. Here, interdependence became visible. Fields were divided and rotated collectively. Mills were shared resources. Market days were scheduled and supervised. Public ovens and wells were maintained. The idea that certain necessities belonged to the community rather than to isolated individuals was woven into practice. These arrangements were not always equitable, but they were functional. They reduced duplication. They created mutual reliance. They reinforced bonds that could support people through hardship. At the next level stood institutions, monasteries, guilds, municipal councils, courts. Each added a layer of memory and regulation. Monasteries preserved texts and agricultural techniques. Guilds protected standards and offered mutual aid. Town councils negotiated rights with rulers. Courts documented disputes and decisions. What ties these layers together is repetition. Medieval society functioned through patterns repeated over years, decades, centuries. Apprenticeship cycles, liturgical cycles, market cycles, legal cycles. These patterns stabilized expectation. Modern culture often celebrates disruption and speed. The medieval world valued predictability and endurance. It operated on the assumption that the future would resemble the past closely enough to justify continuity. That assumption was tested repeatedly by plague, famine, political upheaval. Yet even after profound disruption, communities returned to structure. They rebuilt walls, rewrote charters, re-established trade. The scaffolding held. When we describe medieval fashion or ceremony as absurd, we risk mistaking expression for foundation. Surface details change. Underlying systems persist. The exaggerated shoe or ornate sleeve signaled wealth and rank, but it rested upon a broader economic and social order that defined responsibility and obligation. Symbols were loud because they had to be. In a world without mass literacy or instant communication, identity needed visibility. Authority needed embodiment. Order needed display. The same logic applied to architecture. Buildings were statements of permanence. Stone replaced wood where possible. Towers rose not only for defense or worship, but as declarations of stability. A skyline could reassure inhabitants that their community was anchored. There is also something deeply instructive about the medieval acceptance of limits. Energy came from wind, water, animals, and human labor. Production was bounded by season and climate. Rather than imagining infinite expansion, medieval societies learned to operate within those boundaries. That does not mean they lacked ambition. They built ambitious structures, engaged in long-distance trade, and developed intellectual traditions that still influence the present. But ambition unfolded within constraint, not against it. As we finally close this extended narrative, the Middle Ages emerge as an era defined less by eccentricity and more by endurance. They were centuries of negotiation between fragility and structure, between vulnerability and continuity. People woke each morning in a world they did not fully control. In response, they built systems, legal, economic, architectural, ritual, that gave shape to uncertainty. Those systems were imperfect. They were often unequal, but they were deliberate. And perhaps that is the most important perspective to carry forward. The medieval world was not a chaotic interlude. It was a sustained effort to create order under pressure. Its so-called trends were rarely random. They were embedded within a framework designed to make life legible and durable. Across 1,000 years, that framework held. Not because it was flawless, but because it was structured. And in that structure, visible, repetitive, resilient, we find the true character of the Middle Ages.